was the future King of England, but on this day, he wanted nothing more than peace and silence. Alone in the river, far from royal duties, he found calm until a stranger's eyes found him first. What happened in that moment would ripple through both their lives in ways neither could imagine. Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you liked the story and where you're watching from and why you're following this. The summer sun hung high over the English countryside, casting golden light across the rolling hills and dense forests that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. The year was 1242, and the kingdom thrived under the reign of King Henry, whose court resided in the magnificent stone fortress that overlooked the capital. But on this particular afternoon, far from the political intrigues and ceremonial duties of court life, Prince Edward sought solitude in a place few knew he frequented. The river wound through the woodland like a silver ribbon, its waters crystal clear and refreshingly cool even in the height of summer. Ancient oaks and willows lined its banks, their branches forming a natural canopy that filtered the sunlight into dancing patterns on the water's surface. This secluded bend in the river had become Edward's sanctuary, a place where he could shed the weight of his title and the suffocating expectations that came with being the king's only son. At 24 years of age, Prince Edward cut an impressive figure. His physique was that of a warrior, honed through years of training with sword and lance. Broad shoulders tapered to a narrow waist, and his arms bore the defined muscles of someone who spent hours in the training yard. His hair was dark as a raven's wing, falling just past his shoulders in the manner favored by nobility, though he often tied it back with a leather cord when training. His face was striking, with a strong jawline shadowed by a few days' worth of stubble, high cheekbones, and eyes the color of stormy seas that seemed to hold both intelligence and a hint of restlessness. Today, Edward had dismissed his guards and attendants, insisting he needed time alone to think. The court had been pressing him relentlessly about marriage, presenting him with portraits and descriptions of eligible noble ladies from across England and beyond. Every conversation seemed to circle back to alliances, dowries, and the urgent need to secure the succession. The pressure had become unbearable, driving him to seek refuge in the one place where he could simply be a man rather than a prince. He had ridden his destrier, a powerful black warhorse named Midnight, through the forest paths he had memorized since childhood. The familiar journey calmed his mind, each landmark a reminder of simpler times when his greatest concern had been mastering his swordsmanship or learning to track deer through the undergrowth. After securing Midnight to a sturdy oak, Edward had made his way down to the riverbank, removing his heavy leather boots and the thick woolen tunic trimmed with fox fur that marked his status. The water beckoned invitingly, and Edward waded in slowly, savoring the shock of cold against his heated skin. He wore only his linen breeches, having left his fine clothing folded carefully on the grassy bank, along with the ornate belt that bore his family's crest. The river bottom was smooth stone, worn by centuries of flowing water, and he walked until the depth reached his waist before diving forward into the current. The sensation was liberating. Edward surfaced with a gasp, running his hands through his wet hair and feeling the tension drain from his shoulders. He swam with strong, practiced strokes, moving upstream against the gentle current before allowing it to carry him back. The physical exertion felt good, reminding him of his strength and vitality in a way that sitting through endless council meetings never could. Here, in this moment, he was not Prince Edward, heir to the throne and political pawn in his father's diplomatic games. He was simply a man enjoying the simple pleasure of a swim on a hot summer day. Meanwhile, not far from the prince's secluded spot, a young woman made her way through the forest with practiced ease. Eloise Hartwell was 19 years old, the daughter of a freeman farmer whose lands bordered the royal forest. Her family was neither noble nor impoverished, occupying that precarious middle ground where they owned their land but worked it themselves, unlike the great lords who commanded others to do their labor. Eloise possessed a natural beauty that needed no adornment, though she would have laughed at such a description. Her hair was the color of honey in sunlight, falling in loose waves past her shoulders. She typically kept it braided for practical purposes, but today several strands had escaped, framing a face that seemed carved by an artist's hand. Her eyes were a striking shade of green, reminiscent of new leaves in spring, and they sparkled with intelligence and curiosity. Her features were delicate yet expressive, with high cheekbones, a small straight nose, and lips that curved naturally upward as if she held some delightful secret. Unlike the pale, sheltered ladies of court, Eloise's skin bore the healthy glow of someone who spent her days outdoors. Her hands, though feminine, showed the calluses of honest work. She wore a simple dress of homespun wool dyed a soft blue-gray, with long sleeves and a fitted bodice that laced up the front. Over this, she had thrown a lightweight shawl of undyed linen to protect her shoulders from the sun. Her clothing was clean and well-mended, but lacked the rich fabrics and elaborate embroidery that distinguished nobility from common folk. Eloise carried a woven basket over one arm, already half full of wild herbs and medicinal plants she had gathered from the forest floor. Her mother had taught her the healing properties of every plant that grew in these woods, knowledge passed down through generations of women in her family. The forest held no fears for her. She knew every path, every clearing, every place where the best mushrooms grew, or where wild berries ripened earliest. Today, she sought a particular type of willow bark that grew best near running water. Her father had been complaining of pain in his joints, a common ailment for men who had spent decades working the fields, and she knew the willow bark, when properly prepared, would ease his discomfort. The river bend she had in mind was perhaps a quarter-hour's walk from her family's farmhouse, a place she had visited countless times throughout her life. As Eloise approached the riverbank, she moved quietly, her soft leather shoes making barely a sound on the forest floor. The birds sang overhead, and somewhere in the distance she could hear the drumming of a woodpecker. She smiled, drinking in the peaceful atmosphere, grateful for this brief respite from her daily chores. Her thoughts wandered to the upcoming harvest season, to the new foal born just last week in their small stable, to her younger brother's progress with his letters. She pushed through a final screen of willow branches, stepping into the sunlight that bathed the riverbank, and froze completely. Her basket slipped from suddenly nerveless fingers, landing with a soft thud on the grass. Her breath caught in her throat, and she felt heat flooding her cheeks as her mind struggled to process what her eyes were seeing. There, in the center of the river, was a man. Not just any man, but quite possibly the most magnificent specimen of masculine beauty she had ever encountered. He stood waist-deep in the water, his back to her, and every muscle in his broad shoulders and strong back was clearly defined, glistening with water droplets that caught the sunlight like diamonds. His dark hair was slicked back, revealing a powerful neck and shoulders that spoke of years of physical training. Even from this distance, Eloise could see the careful, economical way he moved, the natural grace that came from complete confidence in his body. As if sensing her presence, the man began to turn, and Eloise knew she should flee, should respect his privacy and pretend she had never stumbled upon this scene. But her feet seemed rooted to the spot, her eyes widening as he completed his turn, and she saw his face for the first time. He was beautiful. There was no other word for it. The strong jawline, the aristocratic features, the way the water streamed down his chest, revealing a physique that would make the legendary warriors of old seem soft by comparison. His eyes met hers across the distance, and she saw surprise flash across his features, followed by something else, something that made her heart begin to pound in her chest. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, frozen in that instant of discovery. Eloise's mind raced, cataloging every detail of this stranger while simultaneously screaming at her to run, to preserve what remained of her modesty and his. But she could not look away, could not break the spell that seemed to have been cast over both of them. Edward, for his part, found himself equally transfixed. He had expected solitude, had believed this spot known only to himself and perhaps a few hunters or foresters. The appearance of this young woman had shocked him, but not nearly as much as his reaction to her presence. Even from across the river he could see she was lovely, with that natural, unaffected beauty so different from the painted and powdered ladies of court. Her expression showed such genuine surprise and embarrassment that he found it oddly endearing. "I apologize," Eloise finally managed to say, her voice coming out smaller than she intended. "I did not know anyone was here. I was gathering herbs and She trailed off, gesturing helplessly at her fallen basket, acutely aware that her explanation sounded absurd even to her own ears. Edward's surprise gave way to a slow smile, and he moved slightly toward the bank, though he remained in water deep enough to preserve modesty. "The fault is mine," he replied, his voice deeper and more cultured than any Eloise had heard before. I should have posted some warning, though I confess I believed this spot unknown to others. I mean, you know alarm. There was something in his accent, in the careful way he spoke, that made Eloise's stomach tighten with sudden apprehension. This was no common farmer or forester. The way he carried himself, the educated manner of his speech, even the quality of the clothing she could now see folded on the riverbank, all spoke of someone far above her station. "You are from the court," she said, not quite a question. Her hand moved unconsciously to smooth her simple dress, suddenly aware of how plain she must appear, how rustic and unsophisticated. Edward hesitated, caught between truth and the desire to maintain the anonymity he had sought in coming here. "I am," he admitted finally, "though today I had hoped to forget that for a few hours. And you are a local maiden, I take it? You know these woods well?" "I have lived here all my life," Eloise replied, some of her natural confidence returning. "My family farms the land just beyond the eastern border of the royal forest. I come to the river often for water plants and herbs." She paused, then added with a touch of defiance, "Though I have never before encountered anyone here." "Then we are both trespassers on each other's solitude," Edward observed with that same disarming smile. "A situation that seems to embarrass us equally, if your blush is any indication." Eloise's hand flew to her cheek, and she felt the heat there confirming his words. "I should go," she said quickly. "I have intruded on your privacy enough. Please, continue your swim. I will find the herbs I need elsewhere." "Wait," Edward called out, surprising himself with the urgency in his voice. There was something about this girl, about the honest embarrassment in her green eyes and the natural grace of her movements, that made him reluctant to let her disappear. "What is your name?" She hesitated, torn between curiosity and propriety. "Eloise," she said finally. "Eloise Hartwell." "Eloise," Edward repeated, tasting the name. "It suits you. I am—" He paused, making a decision that would change both their lives. "I am Edward." The name meant nothing to her beyond its simple Anglo-Saxon origins, and Edward felt a rush of relief at her blank expression. Here was someone who saw him as simply a man, not as a prince, not as a political tool or a prize to be won. The novelty of it was intoxicating. "It is a pleasure to meet you, Edward," Eloise said, executing a small, slightly awkward curtsy. "Even under such unusual circumstances. The pleasure is entirely mine, I assure you," Edward replied with genuine warmth. "Tell me, Eloise Hartwell, do you often gather herbs? Is it something you do for your household, or do you sell them at market?" The question was clearly an attempt to prolong the conversation, and Eloise found herself responding despite her better judgment. "My mother taught me the healing properties of plants," she explained. "I gather them for our family's use, and sometimes for neighbors who have need. There is no physician in our village, so we rely on traditional remedies passed down through generations." Edward found this fascinating, so different from the court physicians with their elaborate theories and expensive treatments. "And does it work, these traditional remedies?" "Often better than what the learned doctors prescribe," Eloise said with a hint of pride. "Nature provides what we need, if we know where to look and how to use it. My mother once cured a fever that had 3 physicians baffled, using nothing more than elderflower tea and willow bark." "Remarkable," Edward murmured, and he meant it. "I would very much like to hear more about such things. Perhaps—" He trailed off, suddenly aware of how forward he was being, how inappropriate it was to suggest further meetings with a young woman he had just met while swimming in a river. Eloise waited, her heart beating faster, wondering what he had been about to propose. Part of her knew she should simply gather her basket and flee, returning to the safety and predictability of her ordinary life. But another part, the part that had always dreamed of adventure and romance beyond the confines of her small village, wanted desperately to know what this mysterious courtier had been about to say. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the gentle gurgling of the river and the distant call of a thrush in the willow branches. Edward cleared his throat, acutely aware of how long he had been standing in the water, how improper this entire situation had become. Yet he found himself reluctant to end the encounter, drawn to this girl in a way he could not fully explain, even to himself. "Perhaps," he began again, choosing his words carefully, "if you come to the river again tomorrow, at the same hour, I might be here as well. We could speak more of your herbal knowledge. I find myself genuinely curious about such practical wisdom, so different from the theoretical learning that occupies most scholars at court. Eloise's eyes widened slightly at the suggestion. She knew she should refuse, should recognize the danger in meeting alone with a stranger, especially one who moved in the elevated circles of the royal court. Her mother had warned her countless times about the predatory nature of noblemen, how they viewed common girls as playthings to be used and discarded. Yet looking into Edward's storm-gray eyes, she saw none of that calculated cruelty. Instead, she saw genuine interest, perhaps even loneliness that mirrored her own. "I should not," she said slowly, though her heart was already betraying her better judgment. "It would not be proper for me to meet with a man unchaperoned, especially one whose full name and station I do not even know." Edward felt a pang of guilt at her words, knowing he was withholding the truth of his identity. But the freedom of being simply Edward, rather than Prince Edward, was too precious to surrender so quickly. "You are right, of course," he acknowledged. "Forgive me for suggesting something that might compromise your reputation. I spoke without thinking, caught up in the novelty of meeting someone so refreshingly honest and knowledgeable." The compliment brought fresh color to Eloise's cheeks. "You are very kind," she murmured, "but I fear you may think better of me than I deserve. I am merely a farmer's daughter with some small knowledge of plants. There is nothing remarkable about me." "I disagree entirely," Edward said firmly. "In my experience, true knowledge is far more valuable than noble blood or inherited titles. The ability to heal, to ease suffering, to understand the natural world around us, these are gifts that should be treasured and respected." His words struck a chord deep within Eloise's heart. She had spent her entire life feeling invisible, overlooked by everyone except her family and the few villagers who sought her mother's remedies. To have this handsome, educated man speak of her knowledge with such genuine respect was intoxicating. Against every sensible instinct, she found herself saying, "If I were to return tomorrow, purely by chance, you understand, and if you happen to be here as well, I suppose there would be no harm in continuing our conversation, provided it remained entirely proper and appropriate." A smile spread across Edward's face, transforming his already handsome features into something that made Eloise's breath catch in her throat. "Of course," he agreed solemnly, though his eyes danced with barely suppressed joy. "Entirely proper and appropriate. I would not dream of anything else." Eloise bent to retrieve her fallen basket, acutely aware of Edward's gaze following her movements. "I should go," she said, straightening and clutching the basket like a shield. "My mother will wonder what has kept me so long. The willow bark I came for will have to wait for another day." "Until tomorrow, then," Edward said softly. "Same hour, same place." "Perhaps," Eloise replied, not quite willing to commit fully even as her heart had already made the decision. "If circumstances allow." With that, she turned and walked swiftly back into the forest, resisting the overwhelming urge to look back at the river one final time. Edward watched her disappear through the willow curtain, listening to her footsteps fade into the general sounds of the forest. Only when he was certain she was truly gone did he emerge from the water, his mind whirling with thoughts of the unexpected encounter. He dressed quickly, pulling on his linen undertunic and the finer woolen overtunic with its subtle embroidery and fur trim. His fingers worked automatically at the leather laces, while his thoughts remained fixed on green eyes and honey-colored hair. What madness had possessed him to suggest another meeting? What could possibly come of pursuing an acquaintance with a common girl, no matter how lovely or intelligent she might be? His father would be apoplectic if he discovered his heir was sneaking off to meet with a farmer's daughter. The entire court would erupt in scandal. And yet, Edward found he did not care. For the first time in months, perhaps years, he felt genuinely excited about something, eager for tomorrow in a way that had nothing to do with duty or obligation. He rode midnight back toward the castle at a leisurely pace, in no hurry to return to the suffocating atmosphere of court politics. The forest path wound through ancient trees, their branches forming a canopy overhead that filtered the afternoon sunlight into golden shafts. Edward had always loved these woods, had spent his childhood exploring every trail and hidden clearing. Today they seemed almost magical, transformed by his encounter with Eloise into something new and wonderful. Meanwhile, Eloise practically ran through the forest, her mind a tumult of conflicting emotions. What had she done? What had she agreed to, even tentatively? She knew nothing about this Edward except that he was educated, well-spoken, and devastatingly handsome. He could be anyone, could have any number of nefarious intentions, and yet something in his manner, in the respectful way he had spoken to her, made her believe he was genuinely kind. She emerged from the tree line to see her family's farmhouse nestled in a small valley, its thatched roof and whitewashed walls glowing in the afternoon sun. Fields of wheat and barley stretched out on either side, nearly ready for harvest. She could see her father in the distance, checking the grain, and her younger brother Thomas playing with their dog near the barn. The familiar sight usually brought her comfort, but today it seemed somehow smaller, more confining than before. "Eloise, there you are." Her mother Margaret appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. She was a handsome woman in her early 40s, with the same green eyes as her daughter, though her honey-colored hair was now streaked with silver. I was beginning to worry. "You have been gone far longer than usual." "I am sorry, Mother," Eloise said, forcing a smile as she approached. "I was delayed. I met someone in the forest." Margaret's expression immediately shifted to concern. "Who? Not one of Lord Ashford's men, I hope. I have heard troubling rumors about their behavior toward village girls." "No, nothing like that," Eloise assured her quickly. "Just a man from the court, swimming in the river. We spoke briefly. Nothing improper occurred." Even as she said the words, Eloise felt the lie of omission burning on her tongue. Nothing improper had occurred, true, but her thoughts about Edward were far from innocent. "A courtier?" Margaret's concern deepened. "Eloise, you must be careful around such men. They are not like the boys from our village. They are educated in the arts of seduction and manipulation. They see common girls as conquests, nothing more." "He was not like that," Eloise protested, though she could not explain how she knew this with such certainty. "He was respectful and kind. He asked about my herbal knowledge and seemed genuinely interested in learning." Margaret studied her daughter's flushed face and bright eyes with growing alarm. She had seen that look before, in other girls who had been dazzled by the attention of men above their station. It never ended well. "Even so, you must promise me you will not seek him out again. Whatever his intentions, nothing good can come from an association between a farmer's daughter and a man of court. The difference in your stations alone makes it impossible." Eloise wanted to argue, wanted to defend Edward and the connection she had felt between them, but her mother's worried expression stopped her. Instead, she simply nodded, not trusting herself to speak without revealing too much. The nod was not quite a lie, she told herself. She had not sought Edward out today, and she would not actively seek him tomorrow. If they happened to meet again at the river, well, that would simply be chance, would it not? That evening, as Eloise helped her mother prepare supper, she found her thoughts constantly drifting back to the river, to the image of Edward standing in the water with sunlight gilding his skin. She burned the porridge twice, earned a sharp reprimand for adding too much salt to the stew, and nearly sliced her finger while cutting bread because she was so distracted. "Where is your mind today?" Margaret asked with exasperation. "You are usually so careful and attentive. This is not like you at all." "I am sorry, Mother," Eloise murmured, focusing determinedly on her tasks. "I am simply tired. I did not sleep well last night." It was true enough. She had lain awake for hours, staring at the thatched ceiling of the small room she shared with her younger sister, her mind spinning with possibilities and fears in equal measure. What if she went to the river tomorrow and Edward was not there? What if she went and he was, but with other courtiers who mocked her for her presumption? What if her mother was right and he had dishonorable intentions? But beneath all these fears ran a current of excitement she could not suppress. What if Edward was exactly as he had seemed? A kind and lonely man seeking genuine human connection. What if tomorrow brought the beginning of something wonderful? At the castle, Edward faced his own interrogation, though from a very different source. He had barely entered his private chambers when his closest friend and advisor, Sir William Blackwood, appeared with a knowing expression on his weathered face. "You have been riding," William observed, noting the dust on Edward's boots and the wind-blown state of his hair. "Alone again, I take it? The guards are most displeased that you continue to slip away without proper escort." "The guards can be displeased all they like," Edward replied, unbuckling his sword belt and tossing it onto a nearby chair. "I am perfectly capable of riding through my own kingdom without a dozen armed men thundering along behind me. Besides, I was never in any danger. I stayed within the royal forest lands." William, who had known Edward since childhood and served as his weapons master before being elevated to the position of personal advisor, was not so easily dismissed. He was a man in his mid-30s, scarred from countless battles but still formidable with sword and lance. More importantly, he possessed a sharp intelligence and unwavering loyalty that made him invaluable to the young prince. "That is not what concerns me," William said, settling into a chair and fixing Edward with a penetrating stare. "What concerns me is the look on your face. I have seen that expression before, usually right before you do something spectacularly ill-advised. What happened during this ride of yours?" Edward considered deflecting, but William knew him too well. Instead, he found himself describing the encounter at the river, though he carefully omitted certain details like the exact location and Eloise's full name. Even to his most trusted friend, he felt protective of the privacy she deserved. "So you have arranged to meet this common girl again tomorrow," William summarized when Edward finished his carefully edited account. "Have you taken leave of your senses entirely? You are the crown prince, Edward. Your father has been arranging potential matches with half the noble houses in England and beyond. What do you think will happen if word of this reaches the king's ears?" "Nothing will happen because no one will know," Edward said firmly. "I am simply talking with an intelligent young woman about herbs and healing. There is nothing scandalous in that." "Is she beautiful?" William asked shrewdly. Edward's hesitation was answer enough. William groaned and ran a hand through his graying hair. "Of course she is. Beautiful and intelligent and completely inappropriate for a man in your position. Edward, I say this as your friend, and not just as your advisor. This can only end badly. Even if your intentions are entirely honorable, which I suspect they are despite your better judgment, the situation itself is impossible. You cannot marry a common girl, no matter how lovely or learned she might be. Your father would never allow it. The nobles would revolt, and the girl herself would be subjected to cruelty and mockery beyond imagining." "I know all of that," Edward said quietly, sinking into a chair across from William. "Do you think I have not run through every logical argument against seeing her again? But William, when I was with her, when we spoke, I felt like myself for the first time in longer than I can remember. Not a prince, not a pawn in my father's political games, just a man having a conversation with a remarkable woman. Can you understand how precious that feeling is? How starved I have been for genuine human connection?" William's expression softened slightly. He had watched Edward grow from an enthusiastic boy into a thoughtful man, had seen the weight of responsibility gradually dim the light in his eyes. He understood the loneliness that came with royal birth, the isolation of knowing that everyone who approached you wanted something, saw you as a means to power or influence rather than as a person. "I do understand," William said gently, "but understanding does not change reality. You have responsibilities, Edward, duties that supersede personal happiness. That is the burden of the crown, and you have always known it would be yours to bear." "One more meeting," Edward said, leaning forward intently. "Just one more conversation. Then I will return to my duties. We'll seriously consider the marriage proposals my father keeps presenting. But give me this one thing, William. This one moment of freedom before I surrender entirely to obligation." William studied his prince and friend, seeing the determination in those gray eyes mixed with something that looked dangerously like desperation. He knew that forbidding Edward from this meeting would only strengthen his resolve. Better to let him have his conversation, satisfy his curiosity, and hopefully realize on his own that nothing could come of it. "One meeting?" William agreed reluctantly. "But you will take at least 2 guards with you, positioned at a discreet distance. And you will promise me that after tomorrow, this ends. No more secret meetings, no matter how innocent they may seem." Edward wanted to argue about the guards, but recognized that William was offering him a compromise. "Agreed," he said. 2 guards at a distance, and after tomorrow, I will focus on my royal duties as I should." Even as he made the promise, Edward wondered if he would be able to keep it. Already, the thought of never seeing Eloise again created a hollow ache in his chest that seemed entirely disproportionate to their brief acquaintance. He told himself it was simply the novelty of meeting someone who treated him as an ordinary man, the appeal of the forbidden. Surely after one more conversation, the fascination would fade, and he could return to his responsibilities with a clear mind. But deep down, in a place he was not yet ready to acknowledge, Edward suspected he was lying to himself. Something about Eloise Hartwell had reached past all his carefully constructed defenses, had touched a part of him he had thought long dead under the weight of duty and expectation. Tomorrow's meeting would either confirm that connection or reveal it as an illusion born of loneliness and a moment's enchantment. Either way, he had to know. That night, both Edward and Eloise lay awake in their respective beds, separated by miles of forest and farmland, but united in their restless anticipation of the coming day. Neither could have predicted that their chance meeting at the river would set in motion events that would shake the very foundations of the kingdom. That the simple conversation they had planned would be the first step on a journey filled with danger, intrigue, and a love that would defy every obstacle placed in its path. As the moon rose over England, casting silver light across castle towers and thatched farmhouses alike, destiny quietly began to weave its threads around two people who had no idea how profoundly they would change each other's lives. The prince and the farmer's daughter, separated by an unbridgeable gulf of status and expectation, had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances. Whether that finding would prove to be a blessing or a curse remained to be seen. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon when Eloise awoke, her heart already racing with anticipation and anxiety. She had dreamed of the river, of storm-gray eyes, and a smile that made her stomach flutter in ways she had never experienced before. Now, lying in the pre-dawn darkness with her younger sister Sarah breathing softly in the bed beside her, reality came crashing back with all its complications and impossibilities. She should not go to the river today. Every rational thought in her mind screamed this truth. Her mother's warnings echoed in her ears, mixing with her own understanding of how the world worked. Men of court did not form genuine attachments to common girls. They took their pleasure where they found it and moved on without a backward glance, leaving ruined reputations and broken hearts in their wake. She had heard the stories, had seen it happen to other girls in neighboring villages. And yet, as the morning light began to filter through the small window, Eloise found herself already planning what she would wear, how she would explain her absence to her mother, what she might say when she saw Edward again. If she saw him again, perhaps he had already forgotten their encounter, had returned to the castle and the sophisticated entertainments available there. Perhaps the whole thing had been a moment's amusement for him, already dismissed from his thoughts while she lay awake, agonizing over every word they had exchanged. "You are thinking very loudly," Sarah murmured sleepily from beside her. At 14, Sarah possessed the uncanny ability to sense when her older sister was troubled, even in sleep. "What is wrong?" "Nothing," Eloise whispered back. "Go back to sleep. It is still early." But Sarah was already sitting up, her eyes adjusting to the dim light as she studied her sister's face. "You are lying. I can always tell when you are lying. You get this little crease right here." She reached out and touched the spot between Eloise's eyebrows. "What happened yesterday?" "Mother said you met someone in the forest." Eloise sighed, knowing that Sarah would not relent until she had at least some portion of the truth. The two sisters had always been close, sharing secrets and dreams in the quiet hours before dawn or late at night when the rest of the household slept. "I met a man," she admitted softly. "A courtier, swimming in the river. We spoke briefly. It was nothing, really." "A courtier?" Sarah's eyes widened with excitement. "Was he handsome? What did he say? Did he try to kiss you?" "Sarah," Eloise hissed, glancing toward the door to ensure their voices had not carried to their parents' room. "Keep your voice down. And no, he did not try to kiss me. We simply talked. He was kind, respectful, interested in my knowledge of herbs and healing." Sarah, who despite her youth possessed a romantic soul that devoured every tale of courtly love she could find, immediately grasped the significance of what her sister was not saying. "You like him," she said with wonder. "Truly like him. I can see it in your face." "It does not matter whether I like him or not," Eloise said firmly, trying to convince herself as much as her sister. "Nothing can come of it. He is from court, probably noble-born, while I am merely a farmer's daughter. Our worlds do not intersect, and they never will." "But they already have intersected," Sarah pointed out with the irrefutable logic of youth. "You met him. You spoke with him. That is already more than most people in our position could ever hope for. What harm could there be in speaking with him again?" "A great deal of harm," Eloise replied, though her conviction was wavering. "Mother warned me to stay away from court men. They are not to be trusted," she said. "They see girls like us as playthings, nothing more." "Did he seem like that to you?" Sarah asked shrewdly. "When you spoke with him, did he treat you with disrespect or make inappropriate suggestions?" Eloise thought back to the encounter, to the genuine interest in Edward's eyes when she had spoken of her herbal knowledge, to the respectful way he had remained in the water to preserve both their modesties. No, she admitted. He was entirely proper. More than that, he seemed lonely, as though he was seeking something he had lost or never had. Then perhaps Mother is wrong, Sarah suggested. Perhaps not all court men are the same. Perhaps this one is different. Eloise wanted desperately to believe this, but years of her mother's careful teaching about the ways of the world held her back. Even if he is different, even if his intentions are entirely honorable, what future could there possibly be? He will return to court, marry some noble lady chosen by his family, and I will remain here, living the same life I have always lived. Best not to begin something that can only end in heartbreak. Sarah reached out and took her sister's hand, squeezing it gently. But what if you are wrong? What if this is the beginning of something wonderful? Would you really let fear prevent you from even discovering what might be possible? You have always been the brave one, Eloise. The one who climbed the highest trees, who explored the deepest parts of the forest, who was never afraid of anything. Do not let fear rule you now. The words struck home, and Eloise felt tears prickling at her eyes. When had she become so cautious, so afraid of taking risks? She thought of all the times she had lectured Sarah about being bold, about not letting others dictate the limits of her dreams. Was she now to ignore her own advice simply because the stakes felt higher, the potential for hurt more real? If I were to go to the river today, she said slowly, and if he happened to be there, what harm would there be in one more conversation? Just to satisfy my curiosity, to prove to myself that there is nothing special about him, that yesterday was simply an anomaly born of surprise and circumstance. Sarah smiled knowingly. Of course, just one more conversation. I am certain that is all it will take to purge him from your thoughts entirely. Despite herself, Eloise laughed softly. You are far too knowing for your age, little sister. Have you been reading those romance tales again? The ones Mother forbids? I have no idea what you are talking about, Sarah replied with exaggerated innocence. I am but a simple farm girl who knows nothing of romance or adventure. They both dissolved into quiet giggles, the tension of the moment broken by their shared laughter. But as the morning light grew stronger, and the sounds of their parents beginning their daily routine filtered through the walls, Eloise's anxiety returned. She would need to find a plausible excuse to visit the river at the same time as yesterday, and she would need to do so without arousing her mother's suspicions further. Across the miles that separated farmhouse from castle, Edward faced his own challenges. He had risen before dawn, unable to sleep past the earliest light, and now paced his chambers like a caged animal. The opulent room, with its tapestries depicting hunting scenes and battles, its massive canopied bed hung with heavy velvet curtains, its carved furniture and thick woolen rugs, felt suffocating. He wanted to be outside, to be riding through the forest toward the river, but the sun had barely risen, and arriving too early would make him seem desperate or worse, presumptuous. A knock at his door interrupted his restless pacing. "Enter," he called, expecting William or perhaps his body servant coming to help him dress. Instead, his father, King Henry himself, strode into the room, his presence immediately filling the space with an almost palpable authority. At 52 years of age, the king remained an imposing figure despite the gray that had begun to thread through his dark hair and beard. He wore a heavy robe of deep burgundy velvet trimmed with ermine, and even in this informal attire, he radiated power and command. "Father," Edward said, surprised by the early visit. The king rarely sought him out in his private chambers, preferring to summon Edward to the throne room or council chamber when he wished to speak. "Is something wrong?" "That is what I have come to ask you," Henry replied, his sharp eyes taking in his son's half-dressed state and obvious agitation. "Your guards reported that you rode out alone again yesterday, dismissing your escort and disappearing for several hours. This behavior is becoming a pattern, Edward, and it concerns me greatly. Where do you go on these solitary rides? What is so important that you must risk your safety and ignore the protocols designed to protect you?" Edward felt a flash of irritation at being spied upon, though he knew the guards were simply doing their duty by reporting to the king. "I go nowhere dangerous, father. I simply ride through the royal forest, enjoying the peace and solitude. Is that such a crime? Am I not entitled to a few hours of freedom from the constant scrutiny of court life?" "You are entitled to nothing beyond what your position demands," Henry said sharply. You are not a common man who can indulge in whims and fancies. You are the crown prince, heir to the throne of England. Every action you take, every choice you make, reflects upon the crown and the kingdom. Your safety is not merely a personal concern, but a matter of state security. Edward bit back the angry retort that rose to his lips. He had heard this speech, in various forms, countless times throughout his life. Duty, responsibility, the weight of the crown, the needs of the kingdom superseding personal desires. He understood the logic, had been raised to accept these truths as fundamental to his existence, but understanding did not make the burden any lighter or the cage any less confining. I apologize for causing you concern, Father, he said carefully, keeping his tone respectful despite his frustration. I will be more mindful of protocol in the future, but surely even you can understand the need for occasional solitude, for time to think without the constant presence of advisors and courtiers. Henry's expression softened slightly, and for a moment Edward glimpsed the father beneath the king. I do understand, he admitted, more than you might think, but the world we live in does not afford us the luxury of indulging such needs without consequence. Which brings me to the other reason for my visit. I have received a most promising proposal from the Duke of Northumberland. His daughter, Lady Catherine, is said to be a beauty of impeccable breeding and education. She is 18 years old, accomplished in all the feminine arts, and the alliance would strengthen our position in the Northern Territories considerably. Edward's heart sank. Another marriage proposal, another noble lady presented as the solution to all political problems. Father, I have asked you for time to consider these matters. I am only 24. Surely there is no urgent need to rush into a marriage alliance. On the contrary, there is every need for urgency, Henry countered. The succession must be secured. You need to produce heirs, multiple heirs, to ensure the stability of the realm. Every year you delay is a year of vulnerability, a year in which rival claimants can position themselves should anything happen to you. I married your mother when I was 21, and you were born within the year. By your age, I already had 2 sons and a daughter. The mention of Edward's mother, dead these past 10 years from a fever, brought a pang of grief. She had been gentle and kind, had understood his need for occasional escape from the pressures of court life. How different things might have been if she had lived, if she could have interceded with his father on his behalf. I will consider Lady Catherine's proposal, Edward said, knowing it was the only response his father would accept. But I will not be rushed into a decision. If I am to marry, if I am to choose a woman who will be my partner for life and the mother of my children, I must be given time to make that choice thoughtfully. Henry studied his son for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Very well, he said finally. I will arrange for Lady Catherine to visit court next month. You will meet her, speak with her, and evaluate whether she would make a suitable bride. But Edward, understand this clearly. You will marry, and you will marry soon. If you cannot choose from among the acceptable candidates presented to you, I will make that choice for you. That is not a threat, merely a statement of reality. The needs of the kingdom must come first, always. With that pronouncement, the king swept from the room, leaving Edward alone with his thoughts and the weight of yet another obligation pressing down upon him. He sank into a chair, his earlier excitement about meeting Eloise now tainted with guilt and uncertainty. What was he doing? Pursuing even a friendship with a common girl, when his father was actively seeking a bride for him? What false hope might he be creating for Eloise? What pain might he be preparing for both of them? Perhaps William was right. Perhaps the kindest thing would be to not go to the river today, to end this before it could truly begin. But even as the thought formed, Edward knew he would not take that path. He had promised Eloise, and more than that, he desperately wanted to see her again, wanted to recapture that feeling of being simply himself that he had experienced in her presence. One more meeting, he told himself, one more conversation, and then he would return to his duties as his father demanded. The morning stretched on with agonizing slowness for both Edward and Eloise. She helped her mother with the morning chores, fed the chickens, collected eggs, and hauled water from the well, all while her mind counted down the hours until afternoon. Her mother noticed her distraction, but attributed it to maidenly daydreaming rather than anything more specific, which allowed Eloise to avoid direct questioning. Finally, as the sun climbed toward its apex and began its descent, Eloise announced that she was going to gather more herbs. Her mother gave her a sharp look but said nothing, though her expression clearly conveyed that she suspected the true purpose of the expedition. Sarah, helping with the mending, caught Eloise's eye and gave her an encouraging smile that bolstered her courage. Edward, meanwhile, had endured a morning of council meetings and petitions, each minute feeling like an hour. William had positioned 2 guards as promised, men who could be trusted to be discreet and who would remain far enough away to allow private conversation. As the appointed hour approached, Edward excused himself from court business, claiming a need for exercise and fresh air. No one questioned him. His daily rides had become expected routine. As Eloise approached the river through the forest path, her heart hammered so loudly in her chest that she was certain every creature in the woods must be able to hear it. What if he was not there? What if he was there with others, making it clear that yesterday had been nothing more than an amusing anecdote to share with his court friends? What if her mother was right and she was walking into a situation that would end in heartbreak or worse? But as she pushed through the final screen of willow branches, she saw him. Edward stood on the riverbank, fully clothed today in a fine tunic of forest green wool, with subtle gold embroidery at the collar and cuffs, dark leather breeches, and tall boots. He had clearly been waiting, and the relief and joy that transformed his face when he saw her emerge from the trees took her breath away. "You came," he said simply, and the wonder in his voice made all her doubts and fears seem suddenly insignificant. "I said I might," Eloise replied, trying to sound casual even as her pulse raced. "If circumstances allowed. It seems they have." Edward took a step toward her, then caught himself, maintaining a respectful distance. In the daylight, with both of them properly clothed, the situation felt simultaneously more proper and more charged with possibility. Eloise noticed details she had missed yesterday in her shock and embarrassment. The quality of his clothing, far finer than anything worn by the merchants who occasionally passed through her village. The way he carried himself, with an unconscious authority that spoke of a lifetime of command and privilege. The carefully tended appearance of his hands, which bore calluses from sword work, but none of the deeper scars and roughness that marked her father's palms. "I was not certain you would come," Edward admitted, his honesty disarming. "I feared I had been too forward yesterday, that I had presumed too much in suggesting we meet again." "You were forward," Eloise agreed, finding her confidence in the familiar surroundings of the forest. Here, on ground she knew intimately, she felt less like an overwhelmed girl and more like herself. "But then, I was perhaps equally forward in accepting your suggestion, even tentatively. We are both guilty of impropriety, it seems." A smile tugged at Edward's lips. "Then we are partners in our transgression. Does that make it better or worse?" "I have not yet decided," Eloise replied, unable to suppress her own smile. "Perhaps you could help me reach a conclusion by telling me more about yourself. Yesterday you learned my name and occupation, while I know only that you are called Edward and serve at court in some capacity. That hardly seems a fair exchange of information." Edward had anticipated this question and had spent much of the sleepless night debating how to answer it. Complete honesty would likely send Eloise fleeing in terror or worse, would transform their interaction into the kind of calculated encounter he was trying to escape. But deception felt wrong, a betrayal of the genuine connection he had felt between them. "You are right," he said slowly, choosing his words with care. "The exchange was unequal. What would you like to know?" "What do you do at court?" Eloise asked, settling herself on a smooth rock near the water's edge. She arranged her skirts carefully, the simple blue-gray wool spreading around her. Today she had taken more care with her appearance than she had admitted even to Sarah, braiding her honey-colored hair in an intricate pattern her mother had taught her, and pinning it up with her best wooden hairpins. She wore her newest dress, the one she usually saved for market days and holy feast days. Edward noticed these small details and was touched by them, understanding the effort they represented. He seated himself on another rock a respectful distance away, close enough for easy conversation but far enough to maintain propriety. "I am involved in various administrative and diplomatic functions," he said, which was technically true even if it vastly understated his actual role. "My position requires me to attend council meetings, review petitions, and occasionally travel to resolve disputes or negotiate agreements." "That sounds terribly dull," Eloise observed with the frankness that Edward was coming to appreciate. "Is that why you escaped to swim in rivers? To find relief from the tedium of paperwork and politics?" Edward laughed, the sound genuine and unrehearsed. "You have identified my motivation exactly. though I should not admit to finding my duties tedious. They are important work, necessary for the functioning of the kingdom. But yes, sometimes the endless meetings and carefully worded documents become suffocating. I crave action, physical challenge, the simple pleasure of being outdoors rather than trapped in stone halls. Then why not choose a different path? Eloise asked. Surely with your education and obvious standing you could pursue other occupations. Become a knight, perhaps, or a scholar, or even a merchant trading in exotic goods from distant lands. The innocent question cut deeper than she could know. My path was chosen for me long before I was old enough to have opinions about it, Edward said quietly. Family obligation, you might say. The expectations placed upon me are not mine to refuse, no matter my personal preferences. Eloise heard the sadness beneath his words and felt a surge of sympathy. I understand something of that, she said. My life too was determined by the circumstances of my birth. As the eldest daughter of a freeman farmer, I will likely marry a man from our village or a neighboring one, bear children, work the land and the household until I am too old to be useful, and eventually die having never traveled more than a day's ride from where I was born. Not a terrible fate, certainly better than many endure, but not one I chose for myself. What would you choose if you could? Edward asked, genuinely curious. If circumstance and obligation were not factors, what life would you create for yourself? No one had ever asked Eloise such a question, and she found herself having to think carefully about the answer. I would want to travel, she said finally, to see the great cities I have only heard about in travelers' tales. London, Paris, Rome. I would want to study with the great healers and physicians, learn everything there is to know about herbs and medicines, perhaps even write it all down, create a comprehensive guide that could help people long after I am gone. And I would want... She hesitated, feeling suddenly vulnerable. What? Edward prompted gently. What else would you want? I would want to choose my own husband, Eloise said softly. Not have one chosen for me based on land holdings or family connections. I would want to marry someone I could talk to, someone who respected my mind as well as valuing any other qualities I might possess. Someone who made me feel alive rather than simply secure. The words hung in the air between them, charged with meaning neither was quite ready to acknowledge. Edward found himself wanting to say that he felt the same way, that he too longed for a marriage based on genuine connection rather than political advantage. But such an admission would reveal too much, would cross a line from which there could be no retreat. Those seem like reasonable desires, he said instead. Not impossible dreams, but realistic hopes for a good life. I pray you may achieve them. And what of your hopes? Eloise challenged. If you could choose freely, what would you want from life? Edward looked out over the river, watching the sunlight dance on its surface. Freedom, he said finally. The ability to make my own choices, to live according to my own values rather than constantly bending to the will and expectations of others. And like you, I would want a marriage based on mutual respect and genuine affection. I would want a wife who saw me as I truly am, not as my position or title. Someone I could trust completely, who would be my partner and friend as well as the mother of my children. That does not seem so much to ask, Eloise observed. Surely at court there are many accomplished young women who would appreciate such qualities in a husband. You would think so, Edward said with a trace of bitterness. But court ladies are raised to see marriage as a transaction, an opportunity to advance their family's interests. They are taught to display accomplishments like jewels, to say what is expected rather than what they truly think. Genuine conversation is rare, honest emotion even rarer. Everyone wears a mask, playing the role assigned to them by birth and circumstance. And which mask are you wearing now? Eloise asked shrewdly. When you speak with me, are you being your true self or simply playing a different role? The question startled Edward with its perceptiveness. He met her green eyes and saw intelligence there, a sharp awareness that would not be satisfied with easy platitudes or charming deflections. I'm trying to be myself, he said honestly. Perhaps more myself than I have been in years, but I confess I am not entirely certain who that self is anymore. I have worn the mask so long it may have become my face. Eloise nodded slowly, accepting the answer. At least you are honest about your uncertainty. That is more than most men would offer. She paused, then added with a slight smile. Though I notice you have still not told me your full name or your exact position at court. Are those secrets you intend to keep? Edward felt his heart rate increase. This was the moment of truth, when he must either reveal his identity or compound his deception with further lies. Before he could formulate a response, a distant sound made both of them turn their heads. Horses moving through the forest, and the jingle of harness and arms that suggested soldiers or guards. Damn, Edward muttered under his breath. The guards William had posted were supposed to remain out of sight and hearing. If they were approaching this closely, something must be wrong. Two riders emerged from the forest path, and Edward recognized them immediately as the men William had assigned to watch over him. Their expressions were urgent, and the senior of the two, a grizzled veteran named Thomas, bowed hastily to Edward before speaking. "Your Highness, forgive the intrusion, but Sir William sent us with urgent news. There has been an incident at the northern border. Raiders from Scotland have attacked several villages. Your father, the king, commands your immediate return to the castle for an emergency council meeting." The words fell like stones into still water, and Edward watched Eloise's face transform as their meaning registered. Her eyes widened, the color draining from her cheeks as she looked from the guard to Edward and back again. "Your Highness?" she repeated faintly. "The king, your father?" Edward stood slowly, every muscle tense as he faced her. "Eloise, I can explain. You are Prince Edward," she said, not quite a question. Her voice was steady, but he could see her hands trembling where they clutched her skirts. "The crown prince, heir to the throne of England." "Yes," he admitted, seeing no point in further deception. "I am. I should have told you yesterday, I know that, but You needed to amuse yourself with a common girl," Eloise finished, her voice hardening as shock gave way to anger and humiliation. "To see how far you could deceive a simple farmer's daughter with your fine words and pretend interest in her knowledge. What a diverting tale this will make when you return to court. The prince and the peasant, perhaps. I am sure your noble friends will find it most entertaining." "No." Edward took a step toward her, but she immediately stepped back, maintaining the distance between them. "Eloise, please, it was not like that. Everything I said to you was true. My interest in your knowledge, my desire for genuine conversation, my appreciation of your intelligence and honesty, all of it was real. The only thing I concealed was my identity, and that was because—" "Because what?" Eloise demanded, tears now threatening at the corners of her eyes, though she fought them back with visible effort. "Because you knew that if I understood who you were, I would never have agreed to meet with you, that I would have recognized the impossibility and impropriety of such an association." "You are right, Your Highness. Had I known the truth, I would have fled yesterday and saved myself this humiliation." "Your Highness, we really must go," Thomas interjected uncomfortably. "The situation at the border is quite serious. Lives may be at stake." Edward wanted to stay, to make Eloise understand, to somehow repair the damage his deception had caused. But duty called, as it always did, and people were in danger. He could not ignore that, no matter how desperately he wanted to make things right with the woman before him. "I will return," he promised Eloise. "Tomorrow, at the same time. Please, I beg you, come back so we can speak properly. Let me explain why I did what I did. Give me a chance to make this right." "But there is nothing to make right, Your Highness," Eloise said, forcing her voice to remain steady despite the emotions roiling inside her. "You are a prince. I am a farmer's daughter. Whatever I may have imagined in my foolishness, whatever connection I thought we shared, it was all an illusion. You belong to your world, and I belong to mine. Those worlds do not and cannot intersect, not in any meaningful way. I see that now, and I thank you for the harsh lesson, even if it was not the one you intended to teach." With that, she turned and walked swiftly back toward the forest path, her spine straight and her head high despite the tears now streaming down her face. Edward watched her disappear into the trees, every instinct screaming at him to follow, to not let her leave, believing the worst of him. But Thomas was already bringing his horse forward, and duty's iron grip was pulling him away. "We ride hard, Your Highness," Thomas said quietly. "The situation is grave." Edward mounted Midnight mechanically, his mind still on Eloise's stricken face and the accusation in her eyes. As they galloped back toward the castle, he barely noticed the familiar landscape flying past. All he could think about was how spectacularly he had ruined everything, how his attempt to find one moment of genuine human connection had resulted in hurting the one person whose opinion had come to matter more than he had realized. The emergency council meeting consumed the rest of the afternoon and stretched long into the evening. The Scottish raids were indeed serious, requiring immediate military response. Edward forced himself to focus, to contribute meaningfully to the strategic discussions, to fulfill his role as Crown Prince and military commander. But beneath the surface, his thoughts kept returning to the river, to green eyes filled with tears and betrayal. When the council finally adjourned near midnight, William found Edward in his chambers, staring out the window toward the forest that lay between castle and farmland. "I heard what happened," William said without preamble. "Thomas told me about the girl discovering your identity. I am sorry, Edward. I know that is not how you wanted her to learn the truth. I should have told her immediately," Edward said bitterly. "The moment we began talking yesterday, I should have been honest about who I am. Instead, I was a coward, so desperate for a few moments of freedom that I deceived her. Now she believes the worst of me, thinks I was merely toying with her for my own amusement. Were you not, in a way?" William asked gently. "Edward, I say this as your friend. What did you think would happen? Even if you had been honest from the beginning, even if she had accepted your identity and continued to meet with you, where could it possibly lead? You are betrothed in all but name to Lady Catherine or someone like her. This girl, no matter how intelligent or lovely, can never be more than a passing acquaintance to you. Perhaps it is better that she learned the truth now, before either of you became more emotionally invested." "What if it is already too late for that?" Edward asked quietly. "What if I am already emotionally invested, far more than wisdom or reason would advise?" William's expression filled with concern and sympathy. "Then you must disinvest yourself immediately. Edward, you know the reality as well as I do. You are the Crown Prince. Your marriage will be a matter of state, chosen to benefit the kingdom and secure important alliances. Personal feelings, no matter how strong, cannot be allowed to interfere with that duty. It is a hard truth, but it is the truth nonetheless." "I know," Edward said wearily. "I have always known. But knowing something intellectually and accepting it emotionally are two very different things. For the first time in my life, William, I met someone who saw me, truly saw me, not my title or my position, but the man beneath, and I threw that away through my own cowardice and deception. If she is as intelligent as you believe, she will understand why you concealed your identity," William offered. "Given time and perspective, she may even forgive the deception." "And what good will forgiveness do?" Edward asked. "It changes nothing. The barriers between us remain insurmountable. You were right from the beginning. I should never have gone to the river that first day, should never have allowed myself to indulge in the fantasy that I could be anything other than what I am." He turned away from the window, his decision made. "Tomorrow I will send a message to the Duke of Northumberland, accepting his daughter's visit to court. I will meet with Lady Catherine, evaluate her as a potential bride, and if she is even remotely suitable, I will move forward with the marriage negotiations. It is past time I put aside childish dreams and accepted my responsibilities." William nodded approval, though he felt a pang of sadness for his friend. "That is the wise course of action. Your father will be pleased." After William left, Edward remained by the window long into the night, watching the moon rise over the forest. Tomorrow, Eloise would not come to the river. Why would she? She had made her feelings abundantly clear. She wanted nothing more to do with him, and he could not blame her for that. He had proven himself unworthy of her trust, had confirmed everything her mother had no doubt warned her about regarding men of court. It was better this way, he told himself. A clean break, painful but necessary. He would throw himself into his duties, would court Lady Catherine with appropriate diligence, would become the prince his father needed him to be, and in time, perhaps, the memory of green eyes and honey-colored hair would fade, becoming just another might have been in a life full of obligations and compromises. Eloise barely remembered the journey back to her family's farmhouse. Her feet carried her along familiar paths, while her mind reeled from the revelation that had shattered her brief, foolish dream. Prince Edward, the Crown Prince of England. She had stood there conversing with him as though they were equals, had shared her hopes and dreams with easy familiarity, had even dared to imagine that the connection she felt might lead somewhere meaningful. The humiliation burned through her like fire. How naive she must have seemed to him. A simple farm girl so easily dazzled by a handsome face and a few kind words. He probably pitied her, or worse, found her presumption amusing. She imagined him returning to court, sharing the tale of the ridiculous peasant who had not even recognized her own prince. The thought made her stomach turn. By the time she reached the farmhouse, the sun had begun its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose that she barely noticed. Her mother was in the kitchen garden, harvesting vegetables for the evening meal, and looked up sharply as Eloise approached. "You have been crying," Margaret said immediately, setting down her basket and moving toward her daughter with concern. "What has happened? Did someone hurt you?" "No one hurt me, Mother," Eloise replied, though the words felt like a lie. Her heart felt bruised, her pride shattered. "I simply learned a hard lesson about the differences between people of station and those without. You were right to warn me about Courtman. I should have listened." Margaret's expression shifted from concern to anger. "That man from yesterday, did he behave inappropriately toward you? If he laid hands on you, I swear I will." "He did nothing improper," Eloise interrupted quickly. "Nothing physical, at least. But he deceived me, Mother. He let me believe he was simply a courtier when in truth he is—" She paused, the words still difficult to speak aloud. "He is Prince Edward, the Crown Prince himself." Margaret's face went pale, then flushed with alarm. "The prince? Sweet Mary and all the saints, Eloise, what have you done? If anyone learns that you met privately with the prince, your reputation will be destroyed. People will assume the worst, no matter the innocent truth of it. You could be ruined." "No one will learn of it," Eloise said wearily. "The prince has far more important matters to attend to than remembering a chance encounter with a farmer's daughter. By tomorrow I will be completely forgotten, just another face that briefly crossed his path and meant nothing." Sarah appeared in the doorway, having clearly overheard at least part of the conversation. "He was the prince?" she breathed, her eyes wide with wonder rather than alarm. "The actual crown prince? And he wanted to meet with you again? Eloise, do you understand how extraordinary that is?" "It is not extraordinary, it is impossible," Eloise snapped, her pain making her voice sharper than she intended. "There is nothing extraordinary about a prince amusing himself with a common girl for an afternoon. It happens all the time in the tales you love so much, and it always ends the same way. The prince returns to his proper world and marries his proper princess, while the common girl is left with a broken heart, and, if she is fortunate, her reputation intact." "But what if this is different?" Sarah persisted with the optimism of youth. "What if he truly cared for you? What if—" "Enough!" Margaret's voice cut through the gathering argument. "There will be no more discussion of this matter. Eloise, you will not return to that river. You will not seek out the prince, and if by some chance he seeks you out, you will refuse to see him. Do I make myself clear? This ends now before it can go any further." Eloise wanted to argue, wanted to insist that she had already reached the same conclusion on her own, that she needed no one to tell her what was obvious, but the fight had gone out of her, replaced by a hollow ache that made even breathing feel difficult. "Yes, Mother," she said quietly. "It ends now." That night, Eloise lay in bed beside Sarah, staring at the darkened ceiling while her sister's breathing gradually slowed into sleep. Tomorrow, Edward would go to the river expecting to find her there. Part of her wanted desperately to go, to hear his explanations and apologies, to see if the connection she had felt was real or merely her own desperate imagination. But her mother was right. Nothing could come of such meetings except pain and possibly scandal. Better to make a clean break, to let the prince return to his world while she remained in hers. And yet, as sleep finally claimed her in the early hours of morning, her dreams were filled with storm-gray eyes and a smile that had made her heart race. She woke with tears on her cheeks and the conviction that forgetting Prince Edward would be far more difficult than she had anticipated. The next day, Eloise threw herself into work with determined energy, volunteering for every task her mother suggested, and several more besides. She scrubbed floors that were already clean, reorganized the herb stores that were perfectly ordered, and spent 2 hours in the garden pulling weeds with such vigor that her mother finally told her to stop before she damaged the vegetable plants. As the afternoon approached, the hour when she would have left for the river, Eloise felt her resolve wavering. What harm would there be in going, just to hear what he had to say? She could listen to his explanations, accept his apology if offered, and then make it clear that they could have no further contact. That would be the mature, reasonable approach, would it not? But she knew that if she went to the river, if she saw Edward again, her determination would crumble like poorly baked bread. One look at his face, one word spoken in that cultured voice, and all her carefully constructed defenses would collapse. She was not strong enough to see him and walk away. Better not to put herself to that test. At the castle, Edward waited until the appointed hour, then made his way to the stables. William intercepted him before he could mount Midnight. "You are going to the river," William said flatly. "Despite everything we discussed last night, despite your promise to move forward with Lady Catherine, you are going to meet that girl again." "I am going to apologize," Edward corrected, "to explain why I concealed my identity and to ensure she understands that my interest in her was genuine, not mockery or cruel amusement. I owe her that much at least. After today, after I have made things right, I will honor my commitment to consider Lady Catherine seriously." William looked skeptical but did not argue further. "Take the same guards as yesterday, and Edward, for both your sakes, I hope this girl has more sense than to meet you. Sometimes the kindest thing is a clean break, no matter how much it hurts in the moment." Edward rode to the river with his heart pounding in anticipation and dread. Would Eloise come? Or had yesterday's revelation driven her away permanently? He tried to prepare himself for disappointment, tried to accept that she might very well choose not to hear his explanations. But hope, that stubborn and often foolish emotion, refused to be suppressed. He reached the familiar bend in the river and dismounted, leaving the guards at their discreet distance. The spot looked exactly as it had 2 days ago, peaceful and beautiful with sunlight filtering through the willow branches and the water flowing steadily over smooth stones. Edward positioned himself near the bank and waited, his eyes fixed on the path where Eloise had appeared on both previous occasions. Minutes passed, then an hour. The sun moved across the sky. The shadows lengthened, and still Edward waited. He told himself she might simply be delayed, that her farm duties might have kept her longer than expected. But as the second hour began, and the sun started its descent toward evening, he was forced to accept the truth. Eloise was not coming. The realization brought a pain sharper than any physical wound Edward had ever endured. He had lost her, lost the connection he had felt with her, lost the possibility of something genuine and true in his life of obligations and pretense. And the loss was entirely his own fault, the consequence of his deception and cowardice. He remained at the river until the failing light made it dangerous to ride back through the forest. Finally, with heavy heart, he mounted Midnight and turned toward the castle. Behind him, the river continued its eternal flowing, indifferent to human pain and the death of fragile hopes. Over the next week, Edward threw himself into preparations for the Scottish crisis with almost manic energy. He met with military commanders, reviewed supply chains, oversaw the mustering of troops, and personally led training exercises in the castle yard. The physical exertion helped, giving him something to focus on besides the hollow ache in his chest. William watched this transformation with mixed feelings. On one hand, Edward was finally behaving as a crown prince should, taking his responsibilities seriously and demonstrating the leadership qualities that would serve him well as king. On the other hand, William could see the cost of this dedication, could see how Edward drove himself to exhaustion each day, as if trying to outrun thoughts that pursued him relentlessly. Lady Catherine arrived at court as scheduled, accompanied by her father, the Duke of Northumberland, and a retinue of servants and ladies-in-waiting. She was indeed beautiful, with porcelain skin, dark hair arranged in elaborate braids, and the kind of refined features that came from generations of noble breeding. She was accomplished in music and needlework, spoke 3 languages fluently, and conducted herself with the perfect deportment expected of a lady of her station. Edward met with her in the castle's formal gardens, chaperoned by her ladies and observed from a discreet distance by various courtiers eager to evaluate the potential future queen. Lady Catherine was everything a prince could want in a bride. She was intelligent without being challenging, beautiful without being vain, and clearly understood the political and diplomatic aspects of royal marriage. She was also, Edward realized within the first hour of conversation, completely unlike Eloise in every meaningful way. Where Eloise spoke her mind freely, Catherine offered carefully considered responses designed to please. Where Eloise's knowledge came from practical experience and genuine curiosity, Catherine's education was theoretical and ornamental. Where Eloise's beauty was natural and unaffected, Catherine's required hours of preparation and careful maintenance. "You seem distracted, Your Highness," Catherine observed with gentle reproach after Edward failed to respond to something she had said about the castle's rose gardens. "I hope I am not boring you with my chatter about flowers." Not at all, my lady, Edward replied, forcing himself to focus. Forgive me, there are military matters weighing on my mind. The situation at the Scottish border requires constant attention. Of course, Catherine said with perfect understanding. You bear such heavy responsibilities. I can only imagine the burden of command. My father has often spoken of the weight that rests upon your shoulders. The words were appropriate, sympathetic, exactly what a supportive wife would say. And yet they rang hollow to Edward's ears, lacking the genuine empathy and insight that had characterized even his brief conversations with Eloise. He found himself wondering what Eloise would say about the Scottish raids, whether she would have some practical perspective born of living close to the land and understanding the lives of common people who suffered most in border conflicts. He caught himself in these comparisons and felt a flash of shame. It was unfair to Catherine, who had done nothing wrong except be exactly what she had been raised to be. She deserved better than a distracted suitor who could not stop thinking about another woman. Perhaps we could walk along the river path, Edward suggested, thinking that the change of scenery might help him focus. The view is quite lovely this time of day. They walked in silence for a while, Catherine making occasional polite observations about the landscape, while Edward struggled with his own thoughts. When they reached a bend in the path that overlooked a distant section of the river, Edward found himself scanning the far bank, half hoping and half dreading to catch a glimpse of honey-colored hair and simple homespun clothing. Your Highness, Catherine said softly, and something in her tone made Edward turn to look at her directly. For the first time since their meeting, he saw genuine emotion in her carefully composed features, a hint of sadness that made her seem suddenly more real. I am not foolish, despite what courtly manners may suggest. I can see that your heart is elsewhere, engaged by someone or something that commands your attention in a way I do not, and perhaps cannot. Edward felt heat rise to his face, embarrassed to have been so transparent. My lady, I apologize. I deserve honesty. Catherine interrupted gently. As do you. So let me be honest with you, Your Highness. This marriage, if it proceeds, will be one of political alliance and mutual respect. I do not expect passionate love or romantic devotion. Those are luxuries rarely afforded to people in our positions. What I do expect is courtesy, fidelity in matters of state, if not necessarily in matters of the heart, and genuine effort to build a partnership that serves the kingdom. The frank speech surprised Edward and earned his respect. You are wiser than I gave you credit for, Lady Catherine, and more perceptive than I realized. I will not insult you further by denying what you have observed. There is someone, or rather there was someone, who briefly captured my attention in a way I did not expect and have not been able to forget. But that situation is impossible, ended before it could truly begin. My duty is here, to the kingdom, and to building the kind of alliance your father and mine envision. Then we understand each other, Catherine said with a small, sad smile. We will both do our duty, Your Highness, and perhaps in time, genuine affection may grow from mutual respect and shared purpose. It has happened before in royal marriages. Perhaps, Edward agreed, though he could not quite make himself believe it. You are very gracious, my lady, more than I deserve. They returned to the castle with an understanding between them, if not precisely friendship. Over the following days, Edward continued to court Catherine with appropriate attention while negotiations proceeded between her father and the king. An official betrothal was expected within the month, followed by marriage before year's end. Edward accepted this progression with resignation rather than enthusiasm, focusing on his military duties and trying not to count the days since he had last seen Eloise. But at night, in the privacy of his chambers, he would stand at the window looking toward the forest and wonder what she was doing, whether she thought of him at all, whether she had forgiven his deception or still believed the worst of his intentions. Meanwhile, at the farmhouse, Eloise struggled through her own days of regret and second-guessing. Had she been too hasty in refusing to hear Edward's explanations? Had she let pride and fear prevent her from at least understanding his perspective? The questions tormented her, especially late at night when sleep proved elusive. Sarah, ever perceptive, tried to encourage her to return to the river, to at least discover whether Edward had come looking for her. But Eloise remained firm in her refusal, convinced that reopening that door would only lead to greater pain. Better to endure the current ache and let time do its healing work than to prolong the agony with false hope. 3 weeks passed in a blur of activity and forced normalcy. Edward's betrothal to Lady Catherine had been officially announced, celebrated with elaborate ceremonies and feasts that left him feeling more trapped than honored. Catherine remained gracious and understanding, never pushing for affection he could not genuinely offer, maintaining the dignified facade they had agreed upon. The wedding was set for the first week of December, giving them barely 2 months to prepare. The Scottish situation had stabilized somewhat, though skirmishes continued along the border. Edward had led 2 expeditions north himself, welcoming the physical danger and exhaustion as distractions from thoughts he could not escape. William worried about his recklessness in battle, the way Edward seemed almost to court death, taking unnecessary risks that made even hardened soldiers nervous. "You fight like a man with nothing to lose," William observed after one particularly harrowing encounter where Edward had charged directly into a group of raiders, scattering them through sheer ferocity, but taking a sword cut to his shoulder in the process. "That is the behavior of a common soldier, not a crown prince whose life is precious to the kingdom." Edward, stripped to the waist while the castle physician stitched the wound, barely flinched at the needle. "I fight like a man doing his duty," he replied tersely. "Is that not what everyone demands of me? To fulfill my obligations regardless of personal cost?" William exchanged a glance with the physician, then waited until they were alone before speaking again. "This is about the girl, is it not? You are punishing yourself for what happened, or perhaps hoping that if you throw yourself into danger often enough, you will stop thinking about her." "I do not wish to discuss this," Edward said flatly, reaching for his shirt despite the physician's protests that the wound needed to breathe. "Whether you wish to discuss it or not, we must," William insisted. "Edward, you are betrothed now. In 2 months, you will be married to Lady Catherine. This self-destructive behavior must end. You have responsibilities to the kingdom, to your future wife, to your father. You cannot continue to risk your life because your heart is engaged elsewhere." Edward rounded on his friend with sudden fury. "Do not presume to lecture me about responsibility, William. I have done everything asked of me. I have accepted the betrothal my father demanded. I have courted Lady Catherine with appropriate attention. I have led our forces against the Scottish raiders. I have attended every tedious council meeting and signed every necessary document. What more do you want from me? My happiness? My heart? Those were forfeited long ago. All that remains is duty, and I am performing it admirably, am I not?" The outburst left both men breathing heavily, the air between them charged with tension. Finally, William spoke more gently. "I want you to find some measure of peace, my friend. This path you are on, this constant battle against your own feelings, will destroy you eventually. Either make peace with your choices, or find the courage to make different ones. But this middle ground of duty performed with resentment and self-recrimination helps no one." Edward sank into a chair, suddenly exhausted. "How do I make peace with betraying the only genuine connection I have felt in my entire life? How do I accept that I will spend the rest of my days wondering what might have been if I had possessed more courage or less obligation? I do not have those answers," William admitted. "But I know that Lady Catherine deserves better than a husband who wishes she were someone else. And that girl, Eloise, deserves better than to be an idealized memory that haunts you. Perhaps you owe them both the truth, difficult as it might be." The conversation stayed with Edward over the following days, gnawing at his conscience. William was right, of course. Catherine deserved honesty, even if that honesty was painful. And Eloise deserved closure, deserved to know that his deception had not been mockery, but rather cowardice born of desperation for connection. The decision crystallized one morning when a messenger arrived from the Duke of Northumberland with detailed plans for the wedding ceremony. Reading through the elaborate arrangements, the guest lists that included half the nobility of England and representatives from foreign courts, Edward felt suffocated by the weight of it all. This was his future, mapped out in meticulous detail, leaving no room for spontaneity or genuine emotion. He found William in the armory, overseeing repairs to damaged equipment from the northern campaigns. "I need to see her," Edward said without preamble. "One final time, to apologize properly, to explain, to achieve some kind of closure before I commit my life to Catherine. I know it is perhaps selfish, perhaps unfair to both women, but I cannot move forward without at least trying to make things right with Eloise." William set down the sword he had been examining and studied Edward's face. What he saw there, a mixture of determination and desperation, told him that argument would be futile. "You will not go to the river," he said finally. That location is too exposed, too easily observed. If you must do this, we will arrange something more discreet. I will make inquiries, find out where the girl lives, and we can arrange a private meeting that will not compromise either of your reputations. Thank you, Edward said quietly, relief flooding through him. I know you think this is a mistake, but I have to try. I think it is probably a mistake, William agreed. But I also think you will never find peace until you do this. So let us at least manage the mistake carefully, shall we? Through careful and discreet inquiries, William learned the location of the Hartwell farm and the basic composition of the family. He reported his findings to Edward that evening in the privacy of the prince's chambers. The girl lives with her parents, a younger brother, and a younger sister, William explained. The father, John Hartwell, is a freeman farmer of good reputation. The mother, Margaret, is known locally as a healer. The family is respected in their community, neither wealthy nor impoverished. Approaching the farmhouse directly would be impossible without drawing attention. However, there is a small chapel about a half-mile from their lands where the family attends services. If you were to wait there tomorrow evening, ostensibly in private prayer, and if someone were to mention to the girl that a nobleman wished to speak with her there, a brief private meeting might be arranged without scandal. Edward nodded slowly, already anticipating Eloise's likely reaction to such a summons. She may not come. In fact, she probably will not come. Why would she, after how I deceived her? Then you will have your answer, William said pragmatically, and you can move forward knowing you tried. But Edward, you must promise me that whatever happens at this meeting, whether she comes or not, whether she forgives you or curses you, it ends there. You will return to the castle, proceed with your wedding to Lady Catherine, and let this girl return to her life in peace. No more clandestine meetings, no more risking both your reputations. One final conversation, and then it truly must be over. I promise, Edward said solemnly. One final meeting, and then I will do my duty as I should have from the beginning. The next day, William arranged for a trusted servant to carry a message to the Hartwell farmhouse. The message was carefully worded to be respectful but urgent. A nobleman who wishes to apologize for past offenses requests the honor of speaking with Eloise Hartwell at the chapel of St. Michael tomorrow at sunset. He swears on his honor that the meeting will be brief, properly chaperoned if desired, and will not compromise her reputation in any way. He asks only for the opportunity to explain and seek forgiveness before circumstances make such conversation impossible. Eloise received the message while helping her mother preserve late-season vegetables. The servant who delivered it was unknown to her, well-dressed and mounted on a quality horse, clearly in the employ of someone wealthy. He handed her the sealed parchment, bowed respectfully, and departed before she could question him. Her hands trembled as she broke the seal and read the carefully penned words. She did not need to ask who the nobleman was. Only one person fit that description, and the mention of past offenses and seeking forgiveness made his identity unmistakable. "What is it?" Margaret asked, noticing her daughter's pale face and shaking hands. "Eloise, what does that message say?" Eloise handed her mother the parchment without speaking. Margaret read it quickly, her expression shifting from concern to alarm to anger in rapid succession. "You will not go," she said firmly. "I forbid it absolutely. That man has already caused you enough pain. Whatever he wants to say, whatever apologies he wishes to make, they change nothing. He is betrothed to a noble lady, soon to be married. His attempts to salve his conscience by seeking your forgiveness are selfish and inappropriate. You will send no reply, and you will certainly not meet with him." "Mother is right," Sarah said quietly from the doorway, surprising both women. She had been listening from the next room, and now she entered with tears in her eyes. "Eloise, I know I encouraged you before, but that was before his betrothal was announced. Now there is no possibility of anything between you. Meeting with him will only reopen wounds that are just beginning to heal. For your own sake, you must refuse." Eloise looked between her mother and sister, seeing genuine concern and love in both their faces. They were right, of course. Nothing good could come from meeting Edward again. His apology, however sincere, would change nothing about their impossible situation. Better to let sleeping dogs lie, to continue the slow process of healing and moving forward with her life. And yet, a small voice in her heart whispered that she would always wonder if she did not go, would always question whether his explanations might have brought understanding, whether closure might have eased the ache that still kept her awake at night. One final conversation, the message had said. One last opportunity to hear the truth from his own lips, rather than imagining endlessly what that truth might be. "I am going," she heard herself say, surprising herself as much as her mother and sister. "Not because I have forgiven him, not because I harbor any foolish hope that our situations have changed, but because I need to hear what he has to say. I need to understand why he did what he did, and I need to tell him, to his face, how his deception hurt me. Then, and only then, will I be able to truly let go and move forward." "Eloise, please," Margaret began, but Eloise shook her head firmly. "I am 19 years old, Mother, old enough to make my own choices, even if they are potentially unwise. I will go to the chapel tomorrow at sunset. I will hear what he has to say, and then I will return home and never speak of this matter again. But I must do this. Surely you can understand that." Margaret looked at her daughter's determined face and recognized the futility of further argument. "Very well," she said with resignation, "but I will accompany you as chaperone. If this meeting is to happen, it will happen with complete propriety, and it will be brief, no more than a few minutes. Do you agree to these conditions?" "I agree," Eloise said, relief and anxiety warring in her chest. Tomorrow at sunset, she would see Edward again. The thought terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. The following day passed with agonizing slowness. Eloise went through her usual tasks mechanically, her mind constantly returning to the approaching meeting. What would she say to him? How would she keep her composure when every instinct would be screaming at her to either flee or throw herself into his arms? She had spent 3 weeks building walls around her heart, trying to convince herself that what she had felt was mere infatuation, easily dismissed and forgotten. Tomorrow would test the strength of those walls. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Eloise changed into her best dress, the one she wore to church on holy days. It was still simple homespun wool, but the deep green color brought out her eyes, and the cut was more flattering than her everyday clothing. She told herself she was not trying to look beautiful for Edward, merely showing appropriate respect for a meeting in a chapel. But the extra care she took with braiding her hair and the rosewater she dabbed at her wrists told a different story. Margaret watched these preparations with a heavy heart, recognizing all too well the signs of a young woman still deeply affected by the man she claimed to have put behind her. But she said nothing, simply wrapped herself in her warmest shawl and prepared to accompany her daughter to what she feared would be another painful encounter. The walk to the chapel took them through familiar fields and woods, the landscape bathed in the golden light of approaching sunset. Eloise's heart pounded harder with each step, her mouth dry despite the cool evening air. What if he had changed his mind? What if he did not come? What if he came with others, making their conversation public and humiliating? But as they approached the small stone chapel that had served their community for generations, Eloise saw a single horse tethered outside, a magnificent black destrier that could only belong to someone of considerable wealth and status. Her steps faltered, and her mother's hand on her arm was both restraint and support. "You can still turn back," Margaret murmured. "It is not too late to preserve your dignity and your heart." "No," Eloise said, gathering her courage. "I have come this far. I will see it through." They entered the chapel, its interior dim and cool after the warmth of the setting sun. Candles flickered on the altar, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. And there, standing before the carved wooden cross, was Edward. He turned at the sound of their entrance, and Eloise's carefully constructed composure nearly shattered at the sight of him. He looked thinner than she remembered, his face marked by new lines of strain and worry. He wore simple clothing by his standards, a dark blue tunic trimmed with silver thread and black leather breeches, his sword belt conspicuously absent in deference to the sacred space. But it was his eyes that captured her attention, storm-gray eyes that held such a mixture of hope and fear and longing that she had to look away before her tears could betray her. "Eloise," he said softly, his voice rough with emotion, "thank you for coming. I was not certain you would." His gaze shifted to Margaret, and he bowed respectfully. "Mistress Hartwell, I presume. Thank you for accompanying your daughter. I know you have every reason to mistrust my intentions, but I swear to you on my honor that I mean Eloise no harm. I wish only to apologize and to explain, if she will grant me that courtesy." Margaret's expression remained stern, but she nodded slightly. You may speak, Your Highness, but I will be listening to every word, and this conversation will not exceed 10 minutes. Is that understood? Perfectly understood, Edward agreed. He turned back to Eloise, drinking in the sight of her like a man dying of thirst. I hardly know where to begin. I have rehearsed this conversation 1,000 times in my mind, and now that you are here before me, all my carefully prepared words seem inadequate. Then perhaps simply the truth would suffice, Eloise said, proud that her voice remained steady despite the turmoil inside her. Why did you conceal your identity? Why let me believe you were merely a courtier when you knew that knowledge of your true status would have prevented me from meeting with you again? Edward took a deep breath, knowing that this moment would determine everything that followed. I concealed my identity because I was a coward, he said bluntly. Because for the first time in longer than I can remember, someone looked at me and saw simply a man, rather than a prince, a title, a political tool. When you spoke to me that first day at the river, you treated me as an equal. You challenged my thoughts, shared your knowledge freely, showed genuine interest in conversation rather than calculating how my attention might benefit you. It was intoxicating, that feeling of being seen for who I am rather than what I represent. And I was terrified that if you knew the truth, that precious illusion would shatter. So you lied to protect your own feelings, Eloise said, anger threading through her voice despite her efforts to remain calm, without consideration for mine. Did you think about how I would feel when I learned the truth? Did you consider the humiliation I would experience, realizing I had been conversing with the Crown Prince as though we were peers? Or did my feelings simply not matter in the face of your desire for an afternoon's entertainment? Your feelings mattered more than you know, Edward replied intensely, taking a step toward her before catching himself. Eloise, I know my deception was wrong. I knew it even as I perpetuated it. But please believe me when I say my interest in you was never mockery or amusement. Everything I told you was true. My appreciation for your knowledge, my admiration for your intelligence and honesty, my enjoyment of our conversations, all of it was genuine. The only falsehood was my identity, and I withheld that information not to demean you, but because I treasured those moments of being treated as a normal man. But you are not a normal man, Eloise shot back. You are the Crown Prince of England, betrothed to a noble lady, destined to be king. Whatever you felt during our brief meetings, whatever connection you believed existed between us, it was built on a foundation of lies. How can you expect me to believe anything you say now when you proved yourself capable of such calculated deception? The accusation struck Edward like a physical blow, all the more painful because he could not entirely refute it. You are right, he admitted quietly. I have given you no reason to trust me. My actions were selfish and thoughtless, motivated by my own desperation for genuine human connection. I do not deserve your forgiveness, and I am not here to ask for it. I came only to tell you the truth, to explain myself as I should have done from the beginning, and to assure you that my deception was not a reflection of your worth, but rather of my own weakness. Margaret, who had been listening to this exchange with growing concern, intervened before Eloise could respond. Your Highness, you have made your apology and offered your explanation. My daughter has heard you. I think it would be best if we ended this conversation now, before either of you says something that cannot be unsaid. But Eloise, her emotions roiling beneath her carefully maintained composure, was not ready to let the matter rest. No, Mother. I have questions that deserve answers. She turned back to Edward, her green eyes blazing with a mixture of hurt and defiance. When you asked me to return to the river for a second meeting, what did you intend? What did you hope would come of continued conversations between us? Surely even then you must have known that nothing could develop between a prince and a farmer's daughter. Were you simply prolonging the deception for your own amusement? Or did you harbor some fantasy that our situations could somehow be overcome? Edward met her gaze steadily, knowing that only complete honesty would serve now. I did not think that far ahead, he confessed. I should have, I know. I should have recognized the impossibility of the situation and ended things after our first encounter. But I was selfish, Eloise. I wanted more time with you, more conversations, more of that feeling of being truly seen and valued for myself. I told myself that we were simply talking, that there was no harm in friendship, that I could manage my feelings and prevent things from becoming complicated. I was lying to myself as much as to you. And now, Eloise asked, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, now that you are betrothed, now that your wedding approaches, Why seek me out? Why force this meeting when we could have simply let the matter rest, allowed time and distance to do their work? What purpose does this serve except to reopen wounds that were beginning to heal? This was the question Edward had dreaded most, because he had no good answer for it. "I could not marry Lady Catherine without attempting to make things right with you," he said slowly. "Without ensuring you understood that my deception was not mockery, that you are worthy of respect and honesty, that the fault lies entirely with me and not with anything you did or failed to do. I needed you to know that what I felt, what I still feel, was real, even if it was also impossible and foolish." "What you still feel?" Eloise repeated, her heart beginning to race. "Your Highness, you are betrothed. Whatever you may have felt during our brief acquaintance should be irrelevant now. You have obligations to Lady Catherine, to your father, to the kingdom. My feelings and yours are luxuries that neither of us can afford to indulge." "I know that," Edward said, anguish clear in his voice. "Do you think I have not told myself the same thing 1,000 times? That I have not tried to convince myself that what I felt was mere infatuation, easily dismissed once I returned to my proper responsibilities. But 3 weeks have passed, Eloise. 3 weeks during which I have courted another woman, planned a wedding, led military campaigns, performed every duty expected of me, and not a single day has gone by when I have not thought of you, wondered about you, regretted the cowardice that cost me your trust." Margaret moved closer to her daughter, placing a protective hand on Eloise's shoulder. "Your Highness, this conversation has gone far beyond what is appropriate. You are betrothed to another woman. My daughter is a respectable young woman whose reputation could be destroyed by association with you. Whatever feelings you may harbor, they cannot be acted upon. You must let this go, for both your sakes." "I know," Edward said again, defeat heavy in his voice. "You are absolutely right, Mistress Hartwell. I should never have requested this meeting. I should have accepted that my deception had consequences I must live with, that some mistakes cannot be corrected no matter how sincere the regret. I will honor my commitment to Lady Catherine. I will fulfill my duties as Crown Prince and future King, and I will carry the knowledge of what I destroyed through my own cowardice for the rest of my life." He turned to leave, unable to bear the pain in Eloise's eyes any longer, unwilling to cause her further distress by prolonging this impossible conversation. But before he could take more than 2 steps toward the chapel door, Eloise's voice stopped him. "Wait," she said softly. "Please, I have something to say as well." Edward turned back, hardly daring to hope, his heart pounding as he waited for her to continue. Eloise took a deep breath, gathering her courage, knowing that what she was about to admit would make her vulnerable in ways she had spent 3 weeks trying to avoid. "I have been angry with you," she said slowly, choosing each word with care. "Furious, actually. Hurt by your deception and humiliated by my own naivety. I convinced myself that you had been playing some cruel game, amusing yourself with a common girl before returning to your proper world. I built walls around my heart and told myself I had been foolish to imagine that our brief meetings meant anything significant." She paused, struggling with emotions that threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. "But I have also been lying to myself, because the truth is that those conversations we shared, brief as they were, meant more to me than I wanted to admit. You made me feel intelligent and valued in ways I had never experienced before. You listened to me as though my thoughts and knowledge mattered, as though I was more than simply a farmer's daughter whose worth would be measured by the children she bore and the work she performed. For the first time in my life, I felt truly seen, and that feeling was as intoxicating for me as it apparently was for you." Edward's breath caught, hope and pain warring in his chest as he listened to Eloise's confession. Margaret's hand tightened on her daughter's shoulder in warning, but Eloise gently removed it, needing to finish what she had started. "I am still angry about your deception," she continued, meeting Edward's gaze directly. "I wish you had been honest from the beginning, even knowing that honesty would have prevented our second meeting. But I also understand, perhaps better than I want to, why you concealed your identity. We are both trapped by circumstances beyond our control, yearning for something we cannot have, struggling against obligations we did not choose but cannot escape. In that, at least, we are equals, regardless of the vast difference in our stations." "Eloise, what are you saying?" Edward asked, hardly daring to interpret her words. "I am saying that I forgive you," Eloise replied, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. Not because your deception was acceptable, but because I understand the loneliness and desperation that motivated it. I am saying that I believe you when you claim your interest was genuine, because I felt the same connection you describe, and I am saying that I release you from any guilt you carry about our situation. You have apologized, you have explained, and now we must both move forward with our separate lives, carrying the memory of what briefly was and what might have been in different circumstances. The tears on Eloise's face undid Edward completely. Without thinking, acting purely on instinct, he crossed the distance between them and gently wiped the tears from her cheeks with his thumbs. The touch was electric, sending shock waves through both of them, and for a moment they simply stood frozen, his hands framing her face, her eyes locked with his. "Eloise," he whispered, her name a prayer and a plea. "I wish things were different. I wish I could offer you more than apologies and regrets. You deserve so much more than what I can give you. And you deserve more than a marriage of political convenience to a woman you do not love," Eloise replied softly, her hands rising to cover his where they still rested against her face. "But we are both bound by duty and obligation. You will marry Lady Catherine and become a good king. I will marry some local man my parents approve of and become a good wife and mother. And we will both wonder, late at night, when we are alone with our thoughts, what might have happened if we had met in different circumstances, as equals in truth rather than merely in spirit." "Your Highness, please step back," Margaret said firmly, though not unkindly. "This has gone far enough. My daughter has offered you forgiveness, which is more generous than many would be. But you must not touch her, must not give either of you false hope that this situation can be anything other than what it is." Edward dropped his hands reluctantly, the loss of contact with Eloise almost physically painful. "You are right, of course. Forgive me. I overstepped." He stepped back, putting proper distance between them once more, though his eyes remained locked on Eloise's face as if trying to memorize every detail. "I should go," he said finally. "This has been harder than I anticipated, but also more healing than I dared hope. Thank you, Eloise, for your forgiveness and your understanding. I will treasure the memory of our conversations, brief as they were, for the rest of my life, and I will try to be worthy of the faith you have shown in believing my intentions were honorable despite my deceptive actions." He turned toward the door, each step feeling like he was tearing away a piece of his soul. But before he could exit the chapel, the sound of horses and shouting from outside made all three of them freeze. The chapel door burst open, and William appeared, his face grim with urgency. "Edward, we must leave immediately," he said without preamble. "There has been an attempt on your father's life. He survived, but the assassin escaped. The castle is in lockdown, and you need to return at once. The entire royal family is in danger." Edward's face went pale. "Is my father badly injured? Who was behind the attack?" "He took a knife wound to the shoulder, but the physicians believe he will recover," William replied quickly. "As for who was behind it, that remains unclear. But there are rumors of a conspiracy involving disaffected nobles who oppose your betrothal to Lady Catherine. They fear the alliance with Northumberland will shift the balance of power at court. We need to get you back to the castle now, before whoever orchestrated this makes another attempt." Edward nodded, his military training taking over despite the emotional turmoil of the past hour. "Eloise, Mistress Hartwell, you must go home immediately and speak of this meeting to no one. If there is indeed a conspiracy, anyone known to have contact with me could be in danger. William, have we secured the road back to the castle?" "We have guards positioned along the route," William confirmed. "But we need to move quickly. Every moment we delay increases the risk." Edward looked at Eloise one final time, drinking in the sight of her face, knowing that this might truly be the last time he ever saw her. "Be safe," he said quietly, "and remember what we spoke of here. Whatever happens, whatever the future brings, know that you have touched my life in ways you cannot imagine. That will have to be enough. And you mine?" Eloise whispered, her heart breaking at the thought of never seeing him again. "Go, protect your father and yourself. The kingdom needs you." With visible reluctance, Edward turned and strode from the chapel, William at his side. Moments later, Eloise and Margaret heard the sound of horses galloping away into the gathering darkness. They stood in silence for a long moment, the weight of all that had been said and left unsaid pressing down upon them. "We should go home," Margaret said gently, putting her arm around her daughter's shaking shoulders. "It is not safe to linger here, and your father will be worried." Eloise nodded mutely, allowing her mother to guide her from the chapel. But as they walked through the darkening fields toward their farmhouse, her mind was racing. An assassination attempt on the king, a conspiracy involving nobles opposed to Edward's betrothal, danger that could extend to anyone known to have contact with the prince. She had thought their impossible situation could not become more complicated. She had believed that forgiveness and farewell would be the end of their story. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. The question was whether those plans would bring them together or tear them further apart. As they reached the farmhouse, Eloise looked back toward where the chapel stood silhouetted against the night sky. Somewhere beyond it, Edward was racing back to the castle, back to danger and conspiracy and the weight of obligations that would consume his life. She whispered a prayer for his safety, for his father's recovery, and for the strength to bear whatever came next. She did not yet know that the conspiracy threatening the throne would soon reach out to touch her own life, that the choice between duty and love would become far more complicated than either she or Edward had imagined, and that the story that had seemed to end in the chapel was, in truth, only beginning. The castle was in chaos when Edward arrived. Guards patrolled every corridor, their weapons drawn, and their expressions tense. Servants huddled in corners, whispering frantically about the attack, and speculating wildly about who might be responsible. Edward strode through the halls with William at his side, heading directly for his father's chambers where the king was being tended by physicians. King Henry lay propped against pillows, his shoulder heavily bandaged and his face pale from blood loss. But his eyes were alert and sharp as Edward entered, and his voice, though weakened, still carried authority. "Edward, thank God you are safe," Henry said, gesturing for his son to approach. "When I heard you had left the castle, I feared the conspirators might have targeted you as well." "Who did this, father?" Edward asked, kneeling beside the bed. "William said there were rumors of nobles opposed to my betrothal, but surely no one would dare such a brazen attack over a marriage alliance." "You underestimate the desperation of men who see their influence threatened," Henry replied grimly. "The Duke of Ashford and several of his allies have long opposed any strengthening of Northumberland's position at court. Your betrothal to Lady Catherine would create an alliance they cannot match. But I did not believe they would go this far, would actually attempt murder to prevent the marriage." "Has the Duke been arrested?" Edward demanded, anger flaring hot in his chest. "If he orchestrated this attack, he must face justice immediately." "We have no proof," William interjected from where he stood by the door. "The assassin was killed by guards before he could be questioned. He wore no livery or identifying marks. Without evidence, we cannot move against Ashford or any other noble, no matter how strong our suspicions. Doing so could trigger civil war." Edward clenched his fists in frustration, understanding the political reality even as he hated it. "Then what do we do? Wait for another attempt? Allow these conspirators to act with impunity because we cannot prove their involvement? We strengthen our defenses and accelerate the wedding," Henry said decisively. "Once you are married to Lady Catherine, the alliance with Northumberland will be solidified. Ashford and his allies will have lost their opportunity to prevent it through violence. The marriage itself becomes our best protection." The word struck Edward like a physical blow. Accelerate the wedding. Instead of 2 months to prepare himself mentally and emotionally for a marriage he did not want, he would now have mere weeks, perhaps even days. The image of Eloise's tear-stained face flashed through his mind, her words about duty and obligation echoing in his memory. "How soon?" he asked quietly. "Within the fortnight if possible," Henry replied. "I have already sent word to the Duke of Northumberland. He agrees that haste is essential, both for security and to demonstrate that we will not be intimidated by threats. The wedding will proceed, and it will be magnificent, showing all of England that this alliance is strong and unshakable." Edward wanted to protest, to argue that he needed more time, that rushing into marriage was not the answer to political conspiracy. But looking at his father's pale face and bandaged shoulder, seeing the determination in those eyes that had guided a kingdom for decades, he knew argument was futile. This was the price of his position. The reality he had always known would eventually come due. "I understand," he said, the words tasting like ashes. "I will do whatever is necessary for the security of the realm." "I knew you would," Henry said with satisfaction. "You are a good son, Edward, a good prince. You will make a fine king when your time comes, and Lady Catherine will be a worthy queen at your side." Edward bowed and excused himself, unable to bear the conversation any longer. He retreated to his own chambers and stood once more at the window overlooking the forest, his mind in turmoil. Within a fortnight, he would be married. Within a fortnight, whatever slim hope he had harbored, however unrealistic and foolish, of somehow finding a path to Eloise would be extinguished forever. He thought of her words in the chapel, her forgiveness and understanding, her acceptance of their impossible situation. She had been braver than he, facing reality with clear eyes while he had clung to futile dreams. Perhaps it was better this way, he told himself. A quick, clean break rather than prolonged agony. In time the pain would fade, replaced by the comfortable numbness of duty performed and expectations met. But even as he tried to convince himself of this, Edward knew he was lying. Some wounds never healed, some losses never stopped aching. Eloise would haunt him for the rest of his life, a reminder of what might have been if he had been born someone else, somewhere else, free to choose his own path. The next morning brought news that sent fresh shock waves through the already unsettled court. The Duke of Ashford had fled the castle during the night, along with several of his closest allies. His sudden departure was as good as a confession of guilt, though it left the king in a difficult position. Ashford had taken refuge on his own heavily fortified estates in the north, making arrest impossible without military action that could indeed trigger civil war. "He has miscalculated," King Henry announced at an emergency council meeting. "By fleeing, he has revealed his guilt and isolated himself. Most nobles will not risk their own positions by supporting an open traitor. We will proceed with the wedding as planned, and once that alliance is secured, we can address Ashford's treason from a position of strength." Lady Catherine arrived at the castle 2 days later, accompanied by her father and a large retinue. If she was disturbed by the circumstances necessitating the accelerated wedding, she gave no sign, maintaining her composure with the grace expected of her breeding. She met privately with Edward to discuss the revised arrangements. "I understand this is not how either of us envisioned our wedding," she said with her characteristic directness. "But we must make the best of difficult circumstances. The ceremony will be smaller than originally planned, but no less binding. I hope we can approach this new timeline with mutual understanding and support." "You are remarkably composed given the chaos surrounding us," Edward observed, genuinely impressed by her calm demeanor. Most women would be distressed by such hasty arrangements. Most women are not raised from birth to understand that marriage, particularly royal marriage, is about duty rather than romance. Catherine replied, "I will not pretend to be thrilled about being married within a fortnight to a man whose heart is elsewhere. But I will do my duty, Edward, and I trust you will do yours. That is all we can promise each other, and perhaps it is enough." Her honesty was both refreshing and painful. Edward found himself wishing he could feel more for this intelligent, gracious woman who deserved so much better than a husband pining for someone else. "You deserve more than I can give you," he said quietly. "But I will try, Catherine. I will genuinely try to be a good husband to you, to build something real between us, even if it is not the passionate love of minstrels' tales. That is all I ask," Catherine said with a slight smile. "Now, shall we review the wedding arrangements? Your father's seamstresses are working day and night on my gown, and we need to finalize the guest list, given the shortened timeline." They spent the next hour discussing practical matters, and Edward was grateful for the distraction from his troubled thoughts. But late that night, alone in his chambers, his mind returned inevitably to Eloise. Did she know about the accelerated wedding? Had word reached her isolated farm about the assassination attempt and the Duke of Ashford's flight? Was she thinking of him as he was thinking of her, wondering what might have been if circumstances had been different? He had no way of knowing that at that very moment Eloise was indeed thinking of him, but for reasons far more immediate and dangerous than simple longing. Because the conspiracy that had threatened the king was about to reach out and touch her own life in ways neither she nor Edward could have anticipated. It began 3 days after their meeting at the chapel. Eloise was in the forest gathering herbs when she encountered a man she did not recognize, well-dressed but travel-worn, his clothing bearing the marks of hard riding. He approached her with a bow that seemed mocking rather than respectful. "Mistress Eloise Hartwell?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "I am," Eloise replied cautiously, her instincts screaming danger. "Who are you and what do you want?" "I'm a messenger from certain parties interested in your acquaintance with Prince Edward," the man said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "We understand you have met with His Highness on several occasions, most recently at the Chapel of St. Michael. We also understand that the prince has developed certain feelings for you, feelings that might prove useful to those who wish to see his betrothal to Lady Catherine dissolved." Eloise felt ice flood her veins. "I have no idea what you are talking about. I have never met the prince. You are mistaken. Please do not insult my intelligence, Mistress Hartwell," the man said, his smile disappearing. "We have witnesses who saw the prince at the chapel. We know he rode there specifically to meet with you. And we know that if certain information about these meetings were to become public, it would create a scandal that could destroy the Northumberland alliance and possibly even force the prince to consider alternative marriage arrangements." "You are threatening me," Eloise said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Threatening to spread lies about improper conduct between myself and the prince to serve some political agenda. But no one will believe such accusations without proof, and I have done nothing wrong." "Have you not?" the man asked silkily. "You met with the prince alone at a river. You met with him again at the chapel, where he touched your face with unmistakable tenderness. Your own mother was present and can confirm this. How difficult do you think it would be to twist those innocent encounters into something sordid?" "To suggest that the prince has been carrying on a secret affair with a common girl while betrothed to a noble lady?" Eloise's mind raced, recognizing the trap that had been laid for her. Even the truth, presented in the right way, could be made to seem scandalous. Her reputation would be destroyed, her family shamed, and worse, Edward's position would be compromised, his betrothal potentially endangered. "What do you want?" she asked quietly, though she already suspected the answer. "My employers wish you to come to the castle publicly," the man explained, "to seek an audience with the prince, ostensibly to petition him about some matter of local concern. Once there, you will behave in a manner that suggests inappropriate intimacy with His Highness. Witnesses will observe this, and the resulting scandal will force the king to reconsider the Northumberland alliance. You will be compensated generously for your cooperation." "And if I refuse?" Eloise demanded, though she already knew the answer to that as well. "Then we will spread our own version of events," the man said with a shrug. "One that paints you as the prince's mistress, using your influence over him for personal gain. Your family will be shunned, your younger sister's marriage prospects destroyed, your parents' reputation ruined. The prince himself will face questions about his judgment and his commitment to Lady Catherine, all of which could have been avoided if you had simply cooperated." Eloise stared at this man who spoke so casually of destroying lives for political advantage, and felt rage surge through her fear. "I will do no such thing," she said firmly. "I will not be used to hurt the prince or to serve whatever conspiracy you represent. Do your worst. I will face whatever consequences come with the truth rather than participate in your schemes." The man's expression hardened. "You are making a mistake, Mistress Hartwell, a very serious mistake. My employers are not people who accept refusal gracefully. If you will not cooperate willingly, other measures will be taken." "Is that a threat against my family?" Eloise demanded, her hands clenching into fists. "Because if you dare to harm them—" "No direct harm will come to your family if you remain silent about this conversation," the man interrupted. "But the scandal we can create will harm them nonetheless. You have 2 days to reconsider your position. After that, events will proceed whether you cooperate or not." He turned and walked away, disappearing into the forest with the confidence of someone who believed he held all the advantages. Eloise stood frozen for several minutes, her basket of herbs forgotten at her feet, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. She was being used as a pawn in a political game she barely understood, targeted because of her connection to Edward. The conspirators, presumably led by the fugitive Duke of Ashford, had decided that destroying Edward's betrothal was worth sacrificing her reputation and his. They had calculated correctly that most people would believe the worst of both a common girl and a prince known to resist his arranged marriage. Eloise knew she should go to the authorities immediately, should report this attempted manipulation, and let the king's justice deal with these conspirators. But who would believe her? She had no proof of the encounter, no evidence beyond her own testimony. And bringing this situation to official attention would inevitably reveal her meetings with Edward, creating exactly the scandal the conspirators wanted. She could warn Edward directly, but how? She could not simply appear at the castle without arousing suspicion. Any message she sent could be intercepted, and even if she succeeded in warning him, what could he do? The conspiracy was already in motion, and her refusal to cooperate would not stop these people from spreading their twisted version of events. For the first time since this entire situation had begun, Eloise felt truly helpless. She had thought the worst consequence of meeting Edward would be a broken heart. She had never imagined being drawn into political intrigue that could destroy both their lives and potentially destabilize the kingdom itself. Eloise returned to the farmhouse in a state of carefully controlled panic. Her mother took one look at her pale face and trembling hands and immediately ushered her into the private space of their small storage room, away from the curious eyes of Sarah and Thomas. "What has happened?" Margaret demanded, gripping her daughter's shoulders. "Eloise, you look as though you have seen a ghost. Tell me what is wrong." Eloise recounted the entire encounter with the mysterious messenger, watching her mother's face shift from concern to horror to righteous fury. When she finished, Margaret was silent for a long moment, her mind clearly working through the implications and options available to them. "We must tell your father," Margaret said finally, "and then we must find a way to warn the prince. These conspirators are playing a dangerous game, and innocent people will be destroyed if they succeed." "How can we warn him, Mother?" Eloise asked desperately. "Any message we send could be intercepted. Any attempt to reach the castle would draw exactly the attention these people want. And even if we succeed in warning him, what can he do? His wedding is mere days away. The conspiracy is already in motion." Margaret's expression grew thoughtful, and Eloise recognized the look her mother got when solving a particularly difficult problem. "There may be a way," she said slowly. "Your father has a cousin who works in the castle kitchens. We have not had much contact with him over the years, but blood is blood. If we could get a message to him, ask him to discreetly inform someone in the prince's inner circle about this threat, it might work without creating the public spectacle these conspirators desire." It was a slim hope, but better than nothing. That evening, after John Hartwell had been informed of the situation and had spent considerable time pacing and cursing the nobility in general and conspirators in particular, he agreed to ride to the castle the following morning under the pretense of delivering vegetables for the wedding feast. His cousin could be trusted to pass along a warning without asking too many questions or drawing unwanted attention. But fate, as it had throughout this entire affair, had other plans. That very night, as Eloise lay sleepless in her bed, she heard the sound of horses approaching the farmhouse. Many horses, moving fast. Her father's voice rang out in alarm, and she heard her mother's sharp intake of breath. Eloise rushed to the window and saw a sight that made her blood run cold. At least a dozen armed men surrounded the farmhouse, their torches casting flickering shadows across the yard. At their head rode a nobleman she recognized from market days, Lord Geoffrey of Westmont, a known ally of the fugitive Duke of Ashford. "John Hartwell," Lord Geoffrey's voice boomed across the yard. "Bring out your daughter Eloise immediately. She is wanted for questioning regarding treasonous conspiracy against the crown." The accusation was so absurd, so clearly fabricated, that Eloise might have laughed if the situation had not been so terrifying. Her father appeared in the doorway, hastily dressed, and gripping an old sword that had hung on their wall for decoration more than defense. "My daughter has committed no treason," John said firmly, though Eloise could hear the fear beneath his brave words. "She is a simple farm girl who knows nothing of court politics or conspiracies. You have been misinformed, my lord." "I have sworn testimony that your daughter has been meeting secretly with Prince Edward, using her feminine wiles to influence him against his betrothal to Lady Catherine," Lord Geoffrey declared, loud enough for his words to carry to the several villagers who had emerged from neighboring farms, drawn by the commotion. "She has conspired to break the alliance between the Crown and Northumberland, working as an agent for enemies of the realm. She will come with us to face the king's justice, or we will take her by force." The trap had sprung even faster than Eloise had anticipated. By accusing her of the very conspiracy they themselves were perpetrating, Ashford's allies had created a situation where any defense she offered would sound like an admission of guilt. If she denied meeting with Edward, she would be branded a liar when witnesses confirmed those meetings. If she admitted the meetings, but claimed innocence, she would still be tainted by scandal. And worst of all, by making these accusations publicly, in front of witnesses, They had ensured that the story would spread throughout the countryside by morning, reaching the castle and creating exactly the crisis they desired. "I will not let you take my daughter," John said, raising his sword with hands that Eloise could see trembling even from her vantage point at the window. "Not without proof of these absurd accusations." "Father, no!" Eloise cried out, rushing from her room. She could not let her father die defending her against charges that, while twisted and malicious, had some basis in truth. She had met with Edward. She had shared intimate conversations with him. The conspiracy was in how those facts were being presented, but the facts themselves could not be denied. She appeared in the doorway beside her father, her chin raised defiantly despite her terror. "I will go with you, Lord Geoffrey, but I demand the right to face my accusers directly and to present my own testimony to the king himself. If I am to be charged with treason, then let it be done properly, with full opportunity for defense." Lord Geoffrey's smile was predatory. "How noble. Yes, you will indeed face the king, girl. And Prince Edward as well, I imagine. It will be most interesting to see how His Highness responds to the revelation of your treacherous conspiracy." Eloise embraced her weeping mother and sister, clasped her father's hand briefly, and then walked with as much dignity as she could muster to where Lord Geoffrey's men waited. They bound her wrists, not roughly but firmly enough to make their control clear, and lifted her onto a horse. As they rode away from the farmhouse toward the castle, Eloise looked back to see her family silhouetted in the doorway, her mother supported by her father, Sarah crying openly. The ride to the castle took several hours, during which Eloise's mind raced through possibilities and strategies. She knew that the moment she arrived, the scandal would explode. Edward's wedding, mere days away, would be endangered. His reputation would be questioned. Lady Catherine would be humiliated. And the alliance with Northumberland that was supposed to stabilize the kingdom would be thrown into chaos. All because she had accepted Edward's invitation to meet at a river, because she had been foolish enough to believe that a prince and a farmer's daughter could share a moment of genuine connection without consequences. They arrived at the castle just before dawn, and Eloise was immediately taken to a holding room while Lord Geoffrey went to inform the king of her arrival. She sat alone in the cold stone chamber, still wearing the simple dress she had worn to bed, her wrists raw from the ropes, and tried to prepare herself for whatever came next. Edward learned of Eloise's arrest within minutes of her arrival at the castle. William burst into his chambers where he was being fitted for his wedding attire, his face grim with urgency. "Edward, there has been a development, a serious one. The girl, Eloise Hartwell, has been brought to the castle under guard, accused of conspiring against your betrothal. Lord Geoffrey of Westmont is making wild claims about secret meetings and treasonous plotting. Your father demands your immediate presence in the throne room." Edward felt the world tilt beneath him. Eloise was here, at the castle, under arrest. The nightmare scenario he had feared, that she would somehow be drawn into the political machinations surrounding his marriage, had materialized in the worst possible way. "This is Ashford's doing," Edward said, pulling away from the protesting seamstress and grabbing his formal tunic. "He is using Eloise to create the scandal he needs to break my betrothal. We have to stop this, William. We cannot let her be destroyed because of me." "Edward, think carefully about what you are about to do," William warned as they strode rapidly toward the throne room. "How you respond to these accusations will determine not just the girl's fate, but the stability of your betrothal, and potentially the kingdom itself. You cannot let emotion override judgment." But Edward was barely listening. His mind focused entirely on reaching Eloise, on protecting her from the consequences of his own actions. He burst into the throne room to find a scene of controlled chaos. King Henry sat on his throne, his wounded shoulder stiffly held, his expression thunderous. Lady Catherine stood to one side with her father, the Duke of Northumberland, both looking shocked and affronted. Lord Geoffrey held center stage, gesturing dramatically as he presented his case to the assembled nobles. And there, standing in the middle of it all with her wrists bound and her chin raised defiantly, was Eloise. Their eyes met across the room, and Edward saw fear there, yes, but also determination, and a strange sort of calm, as if she had already accepted whatever fate awaited her. "Ah, Prince Edward," Lord Geoffrey said with false courtesy, "how fortuitous. Perhaps you can enlighten us about your relationship with this girl. She claims you met with her on several occasions, most recently at a chapel where you touched her with what witnesses describe as unmistakable affection. Is this true? Every eye in the room turned to Edward, waiting for his response. He could deny everything, could claim the meetings were innocent and the witnesses mistaken about what they had seen. He could throw Eloise to the wolves and preserve his betrothal, his reputation, and the political alliance his father deemed essential. Or he could tell the truth and accept the consequences, whatever they might be. Edward looked at Eloise, at the brave, intelligent, kind woman who had seen him truly for perhaps the first time in his life. He thought of her forgiveness in the chapel, her understanding of the impossible situation they both faced, her willingness to sacrifice her own happiness for his duty, and he knew with absolute certainty what he had to do. "It is true," he said clearly, his voice carrying to every corner of the throne room. "I met with Eloise Hartwell twice, once at a river, where we spoke of herbs and healing and the burdens of obligation, and once at a chapel, where I apologized for deceiving her about my identity and sought her forgiveness for my cowardice. At no time did we conspire against my betrothal or against the crown. At no time did she behave with anything other than complete propriety and honor. If there was any impropriety in our meetings, the fault lies entirely with me for seeking them out, not with her for showing me kindness and understanding." The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Lady Catherine's face had gone pale, though whether from anger or hurt, Edward could not tell. The Duke of Northumberland looked apoplectic, clearly calculating how this scandal would affect his position at court. And King Henry's expression had shifted from anger to something more complex, a mixture of disappointment and understanding that suggested he recognized more in his son's confession than simple admission of fact. "Your Highness," Lord Geoffrey said with barely concealed triumph, "you admit to secret meetings with this girl while betrothed to Lady Catherine. Surely you understand how this appears, the questions it raises about your commitment to the alliance your father has worked so hard to secure." "I understand perfectly how it appears," Edward replied, his eyes never leaving Eloise's face. "And I understand that my actions, however innocent in intent, have created scandal and caused pain to people who deserved better. But I will not allow Eloise Hartwell to be branded a conspirator or a temptress when her only crime was showing compassion to someone who desperately needed it. She is guilty of nothing except having the misfortune to encounter me at a vulnerable moment. Any punishment for these meetings should fall on me, not her." King Henry rose slowly from his throne, his presence immediately commanding silence in the room. "Lord Geoffrey, you have made your accusation and presented your evidence. Prince Edward has confirmed that meetings took place but denies any conspiracy. What proof do you have that these meetings were anything more than what my son claims? What evidence of actual treason or plotting against the crown?" Lord Geoffrey hesitated, clearly not having expected Edward to admit the meeting so readily. "The meetings themselves, Your Majesty, conducted in secret and concealed from appropriate authorities, suggest guilty conscience. Why else would the prince hide his contact with this girl if not to pursue a relationship that would undermine his betrothal? Or perhaps," Edward interjected, "I sought privacy because I was tired of every conversation, every action, every moment of my life being scrutinized and judged by people whose only interest is political advantage. Perhaps I wanted one brief opportunity to speak with someone who saw me as a person rather than a pawn. Is that so difficult to understand? Is the desire for genuine human connection now evidence of treason?" The question hung in the air, and Edward saw several of the assembled nobles shift uncomfortably, perhaps recognizing in his words their own occasional longing for escape from the suffocating constraints of court life. "Your Highness," Lady Catherine spoke for the first time, her voice quiet but clear, "I would speak with you privately, if I may, before any final judgments are made." The request surprised everyone, but King Henry nodded permission. Edward followed Catherine to a small antechamber off the main throne room, acutely aware that every eye followed their departure with intense speculation. Once alone, Catherine turned to face him, and Edward braced himself for anger, recrimination, or tears. Instead, he saw only a kind of weary resignation in her face. "I told you before that I am not foolish," Catherine said quietly. "I know you care for this girl, Edward. I saw it in your face the moment you looked at her. The question I must ask, for both our sakes, is whether you care for her enough to give up everything else for her. Your position, your inheritance, the crown that will one day be yours. Because that is what it would cost you, is it not, if you chose her over duty, over alliance, over all the obligations you were born to bear. Edward felt his throat tighten with emotion. "I do not know," he admitted honestly. "A week ago, I would have said no. That duty must always come first. That personal happiness is a luxury I cannot afford." But seeing her standing there, accused of crimes she did not commit, dragged into a conspiracy not of her making because of me, I find myself questioning everything I thought I knew about duty and sacrifice. "Then let me make this easier for you," Catherine said, surprising him again. "I release you from our betrothal, Edward, not because I am angry or hurt, though I confess to being both, but because I deserve a husband who chooses me freely, not one forced into marriage by political necessity and conspiracy. And you deserve the chance to discover whether what you feel for this girl is true love or merely the appeal of the forbidden. My father will be furious, and your father likely more so, but I will make it clear that the decision is mine. I will not be part of a marriage built on regret and obligation." Edward stared at her, stunned by her generosity and courage. "Catherine, you would sacrifice the alliance, your position as future queen, all for a principle?" "I would sacrifice those things to preserve my dignity and my future happiness," Catherine corrected gently. "If I marry you knowing your heart belongs to another, I condemn us both to a lifetime of misery disguised as duty. Better to end it now, cleanly, and allow both of us the possibility of finding something real, even if it is not with each other." She turned to leave, then paused at the door. "For what it is worth, Edward, I hope you find happiness with your farmer's daughter, and I hope you prove worthy of the sacrifice she has unknowingly made simply by caring for you." They returned to the throne room together, and Catherine's announcement of the broken betrothal sent fresh shock waves through the assembled nobles. The Duke of Northumberland raged and threatened. Lord Geoffrey looked confused as his carefully laid trap seemed to collapse around him, and King Henry's face grew darker with every passing moment. "You would throw away everything for a common girl?" the king demanded of his son, his voice shaking with fury and disappointment. "Break the most important alliance of this generation? Disgrace yourself and this family? All for what? A pretty face and a few stolen conversations?" "For the possibility of genuine love and partnership," Edward replied, surprised by his own calm in the face of his father's wrath. "For the chance to choose my own path rather than having it dictated by political necessity. You taught me that a king's first duty is to his kingdom, father. But what good is a king who has sacrificed everything that makes him human? What kind of ruler can I be if I cannot even rule my own heart?" The king opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, a commotion at the throne room entrance interrupted. A messenger burst in, his face flushed with urgency. "Your Majesty, news from the north. The Duke of Ashford has been captured attempting to flee the kingdom. His co-conspirators have been arrested, and they are confessing everything. The assassination attempt, the plot to break Prince Edward's betrothal, all of it. Lord Geoffrey of Westmont is named as a primary accomplice." All eyes turned to Lord Geoffrey, who had gone white as snow. Guards moved to restrain him before he could flee, and the accusations that had seemed so credible moments before now appeared in their true light as part of a treasonous conspiracy. In the chaos that followed, Edward moved to Eloise's side and personally cut the ropes binding her wrists. "I am so sorry," he said quietly. "This never should have happened. You never should have been dragged into this nightmare." "I made my choices," Eloise replied, rubbing her sore wrists, "just as you have made yours. But Edward, you cannot sacrifice everything for me. Your father is right. You have responsibilities to the kingdom that transcend personal happiness. Then help me balance those responsibilities," Edward said, taking her hands in his. "Not as a mistress or a secret shame, but as my wife, my partner, my queen. I know it is unconventional, perhaps even scandalous. I know there will be nobles who object and challenges we cannot yet foresee. But I also know that I love you, Eloise Hartwell. I think I have loved you since the moment I saw you standing on that riverbank, looking at me as though I was simply a man worth knowing, rather than a title to be exploited. Will you marry me?" The throne room, which had been buzzing with conversation about Lord Geoffrey's arrest and the conspiracy's collapse, fell suddenly silent as everyone processed what the prince had just asked. Eloise stared at Edward, her green eyes wide with shock and disbelief. "You cannot be serious," she whispered. "Edward, I am a farmer's daughter. I have no education in statecraft, no training in court protocols, no family connections or political value. I would be a liability to you, a constant source of scandal and speculation. You are intelligent, compassionate, brave, and honest, Edward countered. You understand the lives of common people in ways no noble-born queen ever could. You could be the bridge between the crown and the people, showing them that their king values all his subjects, not just the powerful and well-born. And more than any of that, you would be my partner in truth, not just in political calculation. That has value beyond measure. King Henry, who had been watching this exchange with an expression that shifted from fury to shock to something that might have been grudging respect, finally spoke. Edward, even if I were to allow such a marriage, and that is by no means certain, you understand what you would be asking this girl to endure? The mockery, the contempt, the constant questions about her worthiness? Life at court is difficult enough for those born to it. For a common girl elevated to such heights, it would be unbearable. Then I will bear it, Eloise said, surprising herself with the firmness of her voice. She looked at Edward, seeing in his face not just love but genuine need, and recognized that he was offering her not just a position but a purpose. If Prince Edward truly wants me as his wife, if he believes I can serve the kingdom as queen despite my humble origins, then I will try. Not because I crave power or position, but because I love him, and because perhaps, as he suggests, someone who knows the struggles of common people might indeed make a better queen than someone who has never known hardship or want. The king studied them both for a long moment, and Edward could see the calculation in his father's eyes. A marriage to a common girl would indeed be scandalous, but it could also be politically brilliant. It would demonstrate the crown's connection to all subjects, not just the nobility. It would prevent the Northumberland alliance, yes, but also avoid deepening the resentments that had led to Ashford's conspiracy. And perhaps most importantly, it would give Edward something he had never had before: genuine happiness and partnership. Very well, King Henry said finally, but understand this, both of you. This will not be easy. There will be opposition, mockery, and attempts to undermine you at every turn. Eloise Hartwell, you will need to learn quickly, to prove yourself worthy not just to the nobles, but to the common people who will be watching to see if one of their own can rise to such heights. And Edward, you will need to support her completely, to never give anyone reason to claim she is merely your plaything elevated above her station. If you both commit to this path, truly commit, then I will give my blessing. But it must be a true partnership, a genuine marriage, not a romantic fantasy that crumbles at the first challenge. I commit myself completely, Edward said firmly, never taking his eyes from Eloise's face. As do I, Eloise added, her voice steady despite the fear and excitement warring in her heart. The wedding took place 3 weeks later, not in the grand cathedral originally planned for Edward's marriage to Catherine, but in the small chapel where he and Eloise had first achieved understanding and forgiveness. It was a modest ceremony by royal standards, attended by Edward's family, Eloise's family, and a carefully selected group of nobles and commoners chosen to witness this unprecedented union. Eloise wore a gown of deep blue velvet, simpler than Catherine's would have been but beautifully crafted, with embroidery depicting herbs and healing plants as tribute to her knowledge and skill. Her honey-colored hair was arranged in braids wound with silk ribbons, and she wore a simple silver circlet that marked her new status without overwhelming her natural beauty. Edward, standing at the altar watching her approach on her father's arm, felt his throat tighten with emotion. She looked terrified and brave in equal measure, and he loved her all the more for being willing to take this leap into an unknown future at his side. The vows they spoke were traditional, but Edward and Eloise both knew they meant something deeper. They were pledging not just to love and honor each other, but to forge a new path together, to prove that love and duty need not be enemies, that a prince and a farmer's daughter could build something real and lasting, despite all the obstacles arrayed against them. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife, and Edward kissed Eloise for the first time as her husband, the small congregation erupted in cheers. Not everyone present was happy about the match, Edward knew. There were nobles who saw it as a dangerous precedent, commoners who feared Eloise would forget her roots and become like those she had married into. But there were also people who saw it as hope, as proof that barriers could be crossed and that love, when genuine and committed, could overcome even the most daunting challenges. The celebration that followed was unlike any royal wedding feast in memory. Instead of the elaborate multi-course banquet typically served at such events, The meal was simpler, but more abundant, designed to feed the large number of common people who had been invited to celebrate alongside the nobility. Musicians played both courtly dances and folk tunes, and Edward shocked the assembled nobles by dancing a country reel with his bride, laughing as she taught him steps he had never learned in his formal training. Late in the evening, as the celebration continued around them, Edward and Eloise slipped away to a balcony overlooking the forest. The same forest where they had first met, where everything had begun with a chance encounter at a river. "Are you frightened?" Edward asked quietly, putting his arm around her shoulders. "Terrified," Eloise admitted, leaning into his embrace. "I have no idea how to be a princess, let alone a future queen. I am going to make mistakes, embarrass myself, possibly embarrass you. There will be people who never accept me, who spend every day trying to prove I am unworthy of this position. Then we will face them together," Edward said firmly. "You will not be alone in this, Eloise. I will be beside you every step, helping you learn what you need to know, supporting you through every challenge. And when I am king, you will be my queen, not because of your bloodline or your family connections, but because you are the wisest, kindest, bravest person I know. That will be enough. It has to be enough." Eloise turned to face him, reaching up to touch his cheek gently. "I love you, Edward. Not Prince Edward or future King Edward, but simply you, the man who swam in a river seeking a moment's peace, who had the courage to admit his deception and seek forgiveness, who risked everything to protect me from a conspiracy I barely understood. Whatever challenges we face, whatever obstacles are placed in our path, that love will sustain us. I have to believe that." "I believe it too," Edward said, kissing her forehead tenderly. "We are writing a new story, you and I. Not the one anyone expected, not the one that tradition would dictate, but one that is truly ours. And whatever the ending may be, I know it will be worth every sacrifice, every struggle, because I am living it with you." They stood together on the balcony as night deepened around them, the celebration continuing inside, the future stretching before them with all its uncertainty and promise. They had chosen each other against all odds, against all expectations, and in doing so had proven that sometimes the most unlikely love stories become the most enduring. Years later, when Edward became king and Eloise his queen, their marriage would be remembered as a turning point in the kingdom's history. Queen Eloise's knowledge of herbs and healing would lead to the establishment of hospitals and healers' schools throughout the land. Her understanding of common people's struggles would inform policies that improved the lives of farmers and laborers, and her partnership with Edward, built on genuine love and mutual respect, would become the model for royal marriages that followed. But on that night, standing on the balcony with the man who had first seen her at a river and changed her destiny forever, Eloise knew none of that. She knew only that she had found her place in the world, had discovered a love worth fighting for, and had proven that courage and compassion could overcome even the most insurmountable barriers. And as Edward held her close, both of them looking toward a future they would face together, that knowledge was more than enough.